Saxburgh, remembered by history as Queen Saxburgh of Wessex, England's first ruling queen, and the only woman ever to appear in an Anglo-Saxon regnal list. She came to the throne not by conquest, not by ceremony, not by the cheering of great crowds. She came because there was no one else. A kingdom trembling on its edges, a husband gone, no son to inherit, no clear path forward. And into that silence, a woman stepped forward and placed her hands upon the governance of Wessex. The world she ruled was one of mud and mead halls, of warring sub-kings and encroaching armies, of a church still finding its footing in a barely Christian land. She ruled for 1 year, perhaps 2, and then she was gone, and a monk named Bede, writing half a century later, looked at her reign and chose not to see it. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you've just subscribed, welcome to the family, and if you're returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we'll share the calm, complete story of Queen Saxburgh of Wessex, a woman who lived and governed in 7th century Anglo-Saxon England at a time when kingdoms were still finding their shapes and queens were almost never permitted to rule in their own right. She was the widow of a complicated king, the inheritor of a battered realm, and the only woman whose name was ever entered into the regnal lists of Anglo-Saxon England as a ruler, not as a consort, not as a regent, but as a queen who governed. We'll move gently through her world from the earliest days of the kingdom she would one day rule, the restless, fractured land of Wessex and its West Saxon people, through the turbulent reign of her husband Cenwalh, through the political divorce that nearly destroyed everything, through Cenwalh's exile and transformation, and finally through the years of Saxburgh herself. A woman whose story is made as much of silence and absence as it is of recorded deeds, and who is, for precisely that reason, one of the most quietly remarkable figures in all of early English history. So settle in, pull the blanket close, let the world outside grow still, and let us begin. We have spent a great deal of time in the world of politics and power, in the courts and the chronicles and the complex web of relationships that shaped the fate of the West Saxon kingdom. But history is not only made in throne rooms and mead halls. It is made in the fields and the forests and the river valleys, in the small communities of ordinary people who lived their lives largely outside the notice of the chroniclers, in the physical landscape that shaped and constrained everything that the kings and queens who governed it could hope to achieve. Let us pause then and spend a little time in the landscape itself. Let us try to see the world that Saxburgh moved through, the countryside of 7th century Wessex, with its particular qualities of light and season and geography, its patterns of settlement and agriculture, and the rhythms of work that governed the lives of the vast majority of its people. The Chalk Downs were, and remain today, one of the defining features of the landscape of southern England. Great rolling hills of white chalk, worn smooth by millennia of rain and wind, their upper slopes covered in short, springy turf, and their lower valleys thick with clay and flint, and the rich alluvial deposits of the rivers that drain through them. The downs extend across Hampshire and Wiltshire and Dorset in a series of great waves, interrupted by the valleys of the rivers, the Test, the Itchen, the Avon, the Stour, that cut southward through the chalk on their way to the sea. These river valleys were the corridors of settlement and communication in early Anglo-Saxon Wessex. the routes along which people travelled and traded, and the places where communities clustered, drawing water from the rivers and using the low-lying, richly fertile valley bottoms for their most productive agriculture. Winchester itself, the city that Cenwalh had made into the capital of his restored and Christian kingdom, sat in the valley of the Itchen, sheltered from the north winds by the chalk ridge of St. Catherine's Hill and the downs beyond. The city's Roman walls were still standing in the 7th century, massive constructions of flint and tile and mortar, enclosing an area that the Romans had laid out in a regular grid pattern and that the Anglo-Saxons were slowly filling with their own buildings and institutions. Within those walls stood the old minster that Cenwalh had built or caused to be built, the palace complex from which the West Saxon court operated when it was in residence at Winchester, and the modest but growing community of clergy and lay people who served these institutions. Beyond the walls of Winchester, the countryside of Wessex was shaped by the interplay of agriculture and pasture and woodland that was the fundamental pattern of early medieval land use across most of Britain. The fields that surrounded each settlement, arranged in the irregular, scattered pattern of early Anglo-Saxon agriculture, rather than the more systematic open field systems that would develop in later centuries, produced the grain that was the staple food of the period: wheat, barley, rye, and oats, grown in the strips and plots that each community had cleared from the forest or the moorland over generations of patient effort. The meadows along the riverbanks were grazed by cattle and sheep, whose wool was already becoming the economic foundation of the West Saxon countryside. The forests and the commons provided timber and firewood, and the mast on which the pigs that were the other great source of protein in the Anglo-Saxon diet were fattened in autumn. It was a landscape of considerable beauty, if a beauty that our eyes, accustomed to the managed countryside of later centuries, might find somewhat different in character. There was more forest than there is today, much more in the higher and less accessible parts of the chalk downs and in the clay vales between the chalk ridges. The settlement pattern was thinner and more dispersed, the communities smaller and more isolated from one another. The roads were mostly the inherited structures of the Roman network, repaired and maintained with varying degrees of care and efficiency, supplemented by the trackways that followed the ridges of the chalk downs, ancient routes whose use long preceded the Romans, and which continued to serve as important corridors of movement long after Rome had gone. This was the world that Seixbur's court moved through when it made its itinerant circuits of the kingdom. The king, or queen, and their entourage would travel along the Roman roads and the ridge ways, stopping at the royal estates that were scattered across the landscape and that provided the food, renders and hospitality that sustained the court on its travels. Each estate had its obligations: so many cattle, so many loaves of bread, so many measures of honey, so many nights of hospitality provided to the royal household. These renders were the physical substance of royal authority, the way in which the abstract relationship between the crown and the land was made concrete in the form of food and shelter. When Seixbur's court arrived at an estate, when the dust of the road settled and the noise of horses and people and wagons subsided, the estate's tenants and dependents would have found themselves face to face with the living embodiment of West Saxon governance, the Queen herself, whatever her personal style, whatever mixture of formality and accessibility, of dignity and warmth she brought to these encounters. She was the visible proof that there was still a kingdom, still a centre of authority, still a structure of governance to which they owed obligation and from which they could expect, at least in principle, protection. the ordinary people of Wessex, the farmers and the herdsmen, the millers and the smiths, and the weavers and the potters, the monks and nuns in the small minster churches that were beginning to dot the landscape. These people knew the Queen not through chronicles or historical narratives, but through this kind of direct physical encounter. They saw her arrive. They fed her court. They heard whatever judgments she rendered on the disputes that were brought before her. And then she moved on, and their lives returned to their ordinary rhythms, and the kingdom went on being governed, in the slow and dispersed and deeply practical way that governance always actually works. This is the world that Saexburgh inhabited. Not the high abstract world of political theory or historical narrative, but the immediate, physical, endlessly detailed world of early medieval rural life. The smells of wood smoke and cattle and freshly turned earth, the sounds of grinding mills and children playing, and the distant chant of monks at their daily offices, the feel of chalk paths underfoot, and the cool, clean water of the Itchen on a summer evening. This is where history actually happened, in the 7th century, as in every century, not in the grand gestures of rulers, but in the 1,000 small decisions and encounters and negotiations of which governance is actually composed. Before we move on, let us spend a moment with the name itself, with the particular sound and shape of the name Saexburgh, which is our only guaranteed contact with the person it belonged to. Names in Anglo-Saxon England were not arbitrary labels. They were meaningful constructions, drawn from a relatively limited vocabulary of significant elements that were combined and recombined across generations to create names that reflected the cultural values and the social identities of the people who bore them. An Anglo-Saxon name was a kind of declaration, a statement, encoded in the sound and structure of the name itself, of the world from which the named person came, and the values that world considered important. Saexburgh is a compound name, like almost all Anglo-Saxon personal names, made up of two elements. The first element is seax, which is the Old English word for a short, single-edged knife or sword, a seax, the distinctive weapon that was so closely associated with the Germanic peoples who settled Britain that it gave its name to the Saxons themselves. The Saxons, the West Saxons, the East Saxons, the South Saxons, were, in their own self-understanding, and in the understanding of others, the people of the seax, the people of the blade. The second element is burh, which carries a cluster of related meanings in Old English: a fortified place, a stronghold, a settlement defended by earthworks or walls, and by extension the people who dwell within such a place and the community they form. The burh was the basic unit of Anglo-Saxon defensive organization, the place of safety and strength to which people could retreat, and from which the governance of a territory could be conducted. It gives its name, through a long chain of linguistic development, to the word borough, and through that to the names of countless English towns that were established or expanded as defended settlements in the Anglo-Saxon period. Saexburgh, then, means something like sword stronghold or fortress of the blade, a name that combines the defining emblem of Saxon identity with the concept of a defended and governed place. It is a name that has a martial quality about it, the quality of strength and endurance and the willingness to defend what is one's own. Whether the person who bore this name lived up to its martial implications in any literal sense, whether Saexburgh ever led forces in the field, as some later women rulers would, we cannot say, but the name itself, in its combination of the seax and the burh, of the weapon and the defended place, captures something of what governance in 7th century Wessex actually required. the willingness to assert and maintain authority in a dangerous and contested world. It is worth noting, too, that the name Saexburgh was not unique to our subject. There were other women of this name in the early medieval period, most notably Saexburgh of Ely, the saint and abbess who was the daughter of Anna of East Anglia, the very king who sheltered Kenwal during his exile. That other Saexburgh, a contemporary of Cenwalh, a woman of exceptional piety who eventually succeeded her sister Ethelthryth as abbess of Ely, is sometimes confused with the Saexburgh of our story. But they are different people with different histories and different places in the record. The Saint of Ely is remembered for her holiness and her ecclesiastical achievements. The Queen of Wessex is remembered barely for her reign. They share a name and a world, but not a life. Let us return one more time to the sentence in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that preserves Saexburgh's memory. This year King Kenwalch died, and Saexburga, his queen, reigned 1 year after him. We have already spent some time with this sentence, with its brevity, its matter-of-fact tone, the verb reigned that places Saexburgh firmly in the category of rulers rather than consorts. But there is more to be said about it, if we read it carefully. The phrase, his queen, is interesting. It places Saexburgh in relation to Cenwalh. She is defined, in the first instance, by her connection to him. She is his queen. But the sentence does not stop there. It does not say his queen, who governed for a time, or his queen, who acted as regent, or any of the formulations that would have placed her authority in a subordinate or derivative category. It says she reigned. The reign is hers. The verb is active, not passive. She is the subject of the sentence, not its object. This linguistic precision may seem like a small thing, but in the world of historical record-keeping, small things matter enormously. The choice of words, the decision to say reigned rather than governed or administered, or some other verb that might have implied a more temporary or delegated authority, is itself a historical claim. It places Saexburgh in the same category as the kings listed before and after her. It says, in the dry and careful language of the chronicle tradition, that she was a ruler. The phrase 1 year is also worth attending to. The chronicle is often imprecise about the duration of reigns. Kings are sometimes said to have ruled for periods that later research has shown to be slightly off, because the compilers were working from records that did not always give precise dates. But the specification of 1 year for Saexburgh's reign is notably precise, and notably brief. A reign of 1 year is not a long reign. It is not the kind of reign that leaves behind buildings or laws, or the many visible traces of long-established governance. It is long enough to matter, but short enough to be easily overlooked. And yet it was not overlooked, not entirely. The chronicle preserved it, and in preserving it, the chronicle made possible everything that we have said tonight. All the reconstruction, all the contextualization, all the quiet and careful work of historical imagination that has tried to give flesh and circumstance to the bare bones of the chronicle's entry. The sentence is small, but what it contains is large. A life, a reign, a moment in the history of England when a woman governed one of its kingdoms, and the record chose to remember that she did. To understand Saexburgh, we must first understand the kingdom she would one day govern. We must walk back through the centuries, back before her name appears in any chronicle, back to the beginnings of Wessex itself, a realm that was not yet great, not yet legendary, not yet the seed from which England would eventually grow. In Saexburgh's time, Wessex was still a kingdom in the making, still uncertain of its borders and its future. still shaped by forces it could not always control. The people who would come to be known as the West Saxons, the inhabitants of Wessex, called themselves, in those earliest days, the Gewisse. It is an old name, older than the kingdom itself, older than the walls of Winchester or the great halls of their kings. The word Gewisse, in the Old English of the 7th century, carried something of the meaning of certainty, of people who were reliable, who were known, who were fixed in their identity. The Gewisse were a tribe, a clan, a people shaped by their origins in the upper Thames Valley, in the green and grassy heartlands of what would one day become southern England. They had come, as all the Anglo-Saxon peoples had come, from across the North Sea, from the coasts and forests of what is now Germany and Denmark, and they had settled in Britain over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, gradually pushing westward and southward, pressing the native British peoples before them. By the time we reach the century that concerns us, the 7th century of the Common Era, the Gewisse had long since transformed into the West Saxons, and their tribal territory had become the Kingdom of Wessex. It was a kingdom bordered to the north by the power of Mercia, to the east by the kingdoms of the South Saxons and the East Saxons, to the west by the unconquered lands of the Welsh and the Britons of the far west, and to the south by the long coast of the English Channel. It was a kingdom of rivers and chalk downs, of ancient trackways and new earthworks, of settlements clustered around the bends of streams and the edges of cleared forest. The kings of Wessex traced their lineage back, through legend and genealogy both, to a figure called Cerdic, a chieftain of the earliest Anglo-Saxon settlers who was said to have landed on the southern coast of Britain in the late 5th century, and to have begun the long process of conquest and settlement that would eventually become the West Saxon Kingdom. Whether Cerdic was a single historical person, or a legendary figure around whom many stories accumulated, or perhaps even a British chieftain who adopted Anglo-Saxon ways, we cannot say for certain. The chronicles are old, and the events they describe are older still, and the line between history and legend in those early generations is very thin indeed. But the dynasty that claimed descent from Cerdic, the dynasty into which Saxburh would one day marry, was real enough, and it governed Wessex for generation after generation. Among the kings who preceded Saxburh's husband on the throne of Wessex, two in particular deserve our attention. The first is a king called Cynegils, who ruled from around the year 611 to around the year 643. A long reign by the standards of those violent and uncertain times. Cynegils is remembered for several things. He was the first West Saxon king to accept Christianity, a transformation that came about through the work of a missionary bishop named Birinus, who arrived in Wessex around the year 635 and began the long task of bringing the West Saxons into the fold of the Christian Church. Cynegils was baptized. It was, by the customs of the time, a momentous event, a public declaration not merely of personal faith, but of political alignment, of the kingdom's place in the broader Christian world of early medieval Europe. Oswald, the great Christian king of Northumbria, stood as Cynegils' godfather at that baptism, sealing an alliance between the two kingdoms that was both spiritual and political in its nature. But Cynegils was also a king who faced enormous pressure from outside his borders. Mercia, to the north, was growing in power under a king who would become one of the most formidable rulers of the entire Anglo-Saxon period. That king was Penda. And it is with Penda that the story of Saxburh truly begins. Not because Saxburh ever knew him directly, but because the choices Penda made, and the choices made in response to him, shaped the world that Saxburh would inherit. before we can truly understand the significance of what Saxe-Peur accomplished, before we can appreciate the weight and the fragility of the throne she inherited, we must spend a little more time with the world she inhabited. Because 7th century England was not England. Not yet. What existed in the island of Britain in the year 672, when Saxe-Peur took the throne of Wessex, was something much more complicated and much more contested. A patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own royal family, its own traditions, its own military culture, and its own ambitions for expansion at the expense of its neighbours. Historians sometimes call this arrangement the Heptarchy, from the Greek for 7 rulers, though the number 7 is somewhat misleading. At various points in the Anglo-Saxon period, there were more or fewer than 7 kingdoms, and the boundaries between them shifted constantly as wars were fought and lost, as marriage alliances forged new connections and their breaking severed old ones, as individual rulers died and their kingdoms were divided or absorbed or simply collapsed into the authority of a stronger neighbour. But the idea of the Heptarchy captures something important about the period: the fundamental plurality of the early Anglo-Saxon world, the absence of any single authority that could claim to speak for all of Britain, or even for all of the Germanic settled parts of it. The 7 kingdoms most commonly identified in this framework were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Of these, 3, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, would prove to be the most durable and the most consequential. Northumbria, in the far north, was the kingdom of Oswald and of Bede, a great centre of Christian learning and culture, whose monasteries at Lindisfarne and Jarrow would become among the most important intellectual institutions in early medieval Europe. Mercia, in the centre, was the military powerhouse. The kingdom of Penda and his successors, aggressive and expansionist, always pushing at the borders of its neighbours. And Wessex, in the south, was the kingdom that would eventually outlast both of the others, the kingdom from which, centuries later, England would be born. But in the 7th century, none of this was obvious. In the 7th century, Wessex was a relatively minor player, hemmed in on almost every side and dealing with the consequences of decisions made by its kings and the kings of its neighbours long before Saxe-Peur arrived on the scene. To understand why Saxe-Peur found herself on the throne of Wessex in 672, we need to understand not just the specific events of Kenwal's reign, but the broader pattern of Anglo-Saxon politics that shaped every decision he made, and every decision that was made about him. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the 7th century were bound together and torn apart by a complex web of personal relationships. Kings married the daughters and sisters of other kings. Bishops moved from one kingdom to another, carrying the influence of their former patrons with them. Noblemen served multiple lords over the course of their careers, their loyalties shifting with the political winds. The Church provided a degree of pan-kingdom structure and communication that purely secular politics could not offer. Abbeys and bishoprics corresponded with one another, shared books and scholars, transmitted news and information across the often fluid boundaries of the various kingdoms. In this world, the position of a woman, even a queen, was always defined by relationship. A queen was a daughter before she was a wife, and a wife before she was a ruler. Her political significance derived from who she was connected to: her father's kingdom, her husband's kingdom, the alliances that her marriage embodied, the children through whom her bloodline would flow into the next generation of the political class. The great queens of the period, the women who exercised the most significant influence on the kingdoms around them. were generally women with exceptional personal qualities combined with the right dynastic connections at the right moment. Saexburgh, as we have noted, seems to have had the personal qualities, at least enough of them to hold a throne for a year in circumstances that would have challenged even a fully established male king. But what she did not have, as far as we can tell, was the dynastic network. She came from nowhere that the chronicles chose to record. She had no powerful father whose armies would march for her, no distinguished brothers whose names lent weight to hers, no broader family connection that would have given her a political base independent of her position as Cenwalh's widow. What she had was herself, her own authority, her own intelligence, her own relationships built over the years she had spent as Cenwalh's queen. And for 1 year, perhaps 2, that was enough. Penda of Mercia was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure. He was a pagan in an age that was rapidly turning Christian, a warrior king in a land that was still discovering the limits of its own boundaries, and a leader of such ferocity and political cunning that even Bede, who disapproved deeply of Penda's paganism, could not help but describe him with a kind of reluctant awe. Penda ruled Mercia from somewhere in the 620s until his death in 655, and during that long reign he fought wars against virtually every neighbouring kingdom, killed multiple kings in battle, and extended Mercian power across a vast swath of central England. His relationship with Wessex began with conflict. Around the year 628, Mercian and West Saxon forces clashed at a place called Cirencester, a town that sits even today on what was once the edge of the two kingdoms' territories. The Mercians were the stronger force on that day, and the peace that followed the Battle of Cirencester left Wessex weakened, hemmed in, and brought firmly under the shadow of Mercian power. To seal the arrangement, to turn a military victory into a lasting political bond, an alliance was made through marriage, and the marriage that was made was the one that would eventually set everything else in motion. Penda had a sister. Her name is not recorded in any source that has survived to the present day. We know her only as the sister of Penda, the unnamed woman who was used as a diplomatic instrument to bind Wessex and Mercia together. She was married, around this time, to Cenwalh, the youngest son of the West Saxon king Cynegils, the man who would one day inherit the throne of Wessex and who would become the husband of Saexburgh. We do not know when this first marriage took place with any precision. We do not know whether Cenwalh and Penda's sister lived together in any contentment, or whether their union was simply the cold and ceremonial product of political necessity. We know only that the marriage existed, that it was meant to tie Wessex to Mercia, and that it would eventually be broken in the most provocative way imaginable. But before we reach that moment of rupture, let us spend a little time with the kingdom of Mercia itself, with the world that Penda ruled, and that his sister left behind when she travelled west to marry into the royal house of Wessex. Mercia, in the 7th century, was the dominant power of central England. Its name meant, roughly, the march, the borderland, and it occupied the great central heartlands of Britain, stretching from the Thames Valley in the south to the edges of Northumbria in the north, from the borders of East Anglia in the east to the territories of the Welsh kingdoms in the west. It was a kingdom of flat plains and wide river valleys, of the Trent and the Severn and the Avon, of rich agricultural land and ancient trackways that had been crossed by countless generations before the Mercians ever arrived. Under Penda, Mercia was driven by an almost ceaseless appetite for conquest and dominance. Penda fought against the Northumbrians with particular intensity, killing 2 of their greatest kings in battle, Edwin at Hatfield Chase in 633 and Oswald at Maserfield in 642. That last victory, the killing of Oswald, who had been not only the king of Northumbria, but the godfather of Kenwal's own father Cynegils, struck directly at the alliances that had protected Wessex. With Oswald gone, the West Saxons lost a powerful friend in the north, and within a year, Cynegils was dead, and the throne of Wessex passed to his son, Kenwal. The death of Penda of Mercia in 655, at the Battle of Winwed, was one of the most consequential events of the 7th century, not just for Northumbria, which had borne the brunt of Penda's aggression, but for all the kingdoms of England, including Wessex. Penda had been the dominant military figure of the period, aggressive, strategically brilliant, utterly without scruple when it came to using force as a tool of political expansion. His paganism had made him, in the eyes of Bede and the Christian chroniclers who followed him, a kind of villain, the dark force against which the Christian kings of England defined themselves. His death, at the hands of the Northumbrian king Oswiu, at an unnamed river in the north, was celebrated by the ecclesiastical writers of the period as a victory not merely of one king over another, but of Christianity over paganism. For Cenwalh in Wessex, Penda's death meant something more personal. It meant the end of the direct threat, the removal of the man who had driven him into exile, who had imposed Mercian dominance over his kingdom, who had remained throughout the years of Cenwalh's restored reign, the most dangerous figure on the political horizon. With Penda gone, Cenwalh could breathe somewhat more freely. He could pursue his Christian projects, the building of the Old Minster, the reorganization of the diocese, without the constant awareness that the pagan king of Mercia might at any moment decide that Wessex had become too strong or too independent for his comfort. But Penda's death did not end Mercian pressure, as we have seen. His son Wulfhere was a formidable successor, and the campaigns of the 660s that stripped away the Isle of Wight and the lands north of the Thames were Wulfhere's work, not his father's. The transformation that Penda's death brought about was not the elimination of Mercian aggression, but its rechanneling. From the raw pagan violence of Penda's wars to the more complex, Christian-framed aggression of Wulfhere's campaigns, in which ecclesiastical politics and land grants and the manipulation of bishops and sub-kings were as important as military force. It was in this more complex environment that the latter part of Cenwalh's reign unfolded, and it was in this environment that Saexbur served as queen consort. The threats she would have understood, the threats she would have had to navigate as queen regnant, however briefly, were not the simple military threats of an earlier generation, but the more intricate dangers of a world in which Mercia used religion and land and marriage alliances as tools of expansion alongside its armies. Understanding this complexity is essential to understanding the difficulty of Saexbur's position when she came to the throne. She inherited not just a battered and diminished kingdom, but a kingdom whose governance was bound up in a web of obligations and relationships and pressures that had been developing for decades. To govern Wessex in 672 was not simply to give orders from a throne. It was to manage that entire web, to know which threads were strongest and which were fraying, to understand what each of the major figures in the kingdom's political life wanted and feared and was capable of, and to make decisions that held the whole fragile structure together. Saexbur understood that web. She had been watching it being woven for years, and when the moment came, she did what she could with the understanding she had. The years of Cenwalh's exile in East Anglia are worth dwelling on, not only because of the spiritual transformation they produced, the baptism and the conversion to Christianity, but because of the political connections they created. Anna of East Anglia, who sheltered Kenwal during those 3 years, was himself a significant figure in the politics of the period, and his court was a remarkable place. One of the centres of early Christian culture in England, and the family within which several of the most celebrated saints of the period were born and raised. Anna's daughters, in particular, became some of the most important women in the history of early Anglo-Saxon Christianity. Ethelthryth, or Etheldreda, as she is sometimes called, founded the monastery of Ely and became one of the most venerated saints of the Anglo-Saxon period. Her sister Sexbur of Ely, not our Sexbur, but the other woman of the same name, Anna's daughter, became the abbess of Ely after her sister's death, and was herself later venerated as a saint. A third daughter, Ethelbur, was also an abbess and a revered figure in the religious life of the period. This remarkable family, the daughters of Anna of East Anglia, represents one of the great concentrations of female religious authority in early Anglo-Saxon England. Their careers as abbesses and foundresses of religious communities gave them a kind of power and influence that was unusual for women of the period, and the cults that grew up around them after their deaths ensured that their stories were preserved with a care and attention that most women of the 7th century, including, as we have seen, Sexbur of Wessex, did not receive. The connection between Kenwal's exile in East Anglia and the family of Anna is worth noting for another reason. It shows us that the world of 7th century Anglo-Saxon England was smaller in some respects than we might imagine. Kenwal was sheltered by Anna. Anna's daughter Sexbur of Ely eventually succeeded her sister as abbess of Ely, a community that was connected by bonds of kinship and religious culture to the court of East Anglia and beyond. The woman who had married Kenwal and who would eventually rule Wessex in her own right bore the same name as this sainted abbess. Whether there is any connection between the two Sexburgs, whether they were acquainted, whether the naming was significant, whether some relationship between the two women existed that the historical record has not preserved, we cannot say. But the coincidence of the names is a small and suggestive thread in the fabric of the period, a reminder that the great families of 7th century England were connected to one another in ways that the surviving sources only partially illuminate. The question of what the Christian Church of the 7th century thought about women in positions of political authority is a complicated one, and it is central to understanding both why Sexbur was able to rule and why Bede found it difficult to acknowledge that she had. The early church had inherited from the classical world a deeply ambivalent view of women in public life. On one hand, the scriptural tradition contained examples of women in positions of authority and significance, the prophetesses and judges of the Hebrew Bible, the women who were the first witnesses to the resurrection, the female leaders of some of the earliest Christian communities who are named in Paul's letters. On the other hand, the same scriptural tradition contained passages that seem to restrict women's roles. Paul's injunctions about women keeping silent in churches, the assumption in most of the epistles that the leaders of communities would be male, the general tendency of the early church to reproduce the gender hierarchies of the societies within which it operated. In the early medieval period, these competing threads of the tradition were being worked out in real time, in the context of actual communities, and actual women were doing things that the inherited frameworks did not quite know how to accommodate. The great abbesses of the period, women like Hild of Whitby and the daughters of Anna of East Anglia, were doing something that the simple rule of women must not lead could not account for. they were leading. They were governing large communities of monks and nuns. They were exercising ecclesiastical authority in ways that made them the equals or superiors of many bishops. And the Church, by and large, accepted this. Because these women's communities were doing valuable work, because their holiness was beyond question, because the institutional Church needed the abbesses and their monasteries as allies and as instruments of Christianization. But the acceptance of women in ecclesiastical leadership positions did not automatically translate into acceptance of women in political leadership positions. The abbess's authority was understood as a religious authority, the authority of holiness, of the monastic rule, of the ascetic discipline that set the religious community apart from the secular world. The Queen's authority was understood as a political authority, derived from military capacity, from the ability to command the loyalty of warriors, from the physical and social dominance of the warrior lord. These were different kinds of authority, and the Church's accommodation of the first did not require it to accommodate the second. Bede, as a churchman deeply embedded in the traditions of early medieval ecclesiastical culture, would have been acutely aware of these distinctions. When he looked at Siaxber's reign, at a woman exercising political authority over a secular kingdom, he was looking at something that sat outside the categories he was most comfortable with. The female abbess he could celebrate, the female ruler he found it easier to elide, and so he described the period of her reign as a period of political fragmentation, rather than as a period of female governance, not perhaps because he was consciously lying, but because his framework for understanding governance simply did not have a comfortable place for what Siaxber had done. This is not a criticism of Bede, who was, by any measure, one of the greatest historical minds of his age. It is a reminder that even the greatest minds are shaped by the assumptions of their times and their communities, and that those assumptions have consequences for what they are able to see and what they are unable to acknowledge. Cenwalh, later known as King Cenwalh of Wessex, or Cenwyl, as his name is sometimes rendered, inherited a kingdom that was already living in the long shadow of Mercian power. He was young, probably, when he took the throne around the year 643, and he was, at the time of his accession, still a pagan. This is perhaps surprising, given that his father Cynegils had been baptized and had made Wessex, at least officially, a Christian kingdom. But Cenwalh was not yet ready, or not yet willing, to embrace the new faith. Bede, writing later, would describe him with a measure of disapproval, noting that Cenwalh refused to embrace the mysteries of the faith when he came to the throne, and framing what followed as a kind of divine punishment for that refusal. What followed, in any case, was catastrophe, though a catastrophe that was also, in its way, a transformation. Cenwalh had been married, as we have noted, to the sister of Penda of Mercia. This marriage was a political arrangement, a mechanism for keeping the peace between two kingdoms, with very different interests and very different ideas about where their borders should lie. But at some point shortly after Cenwalh came to the throne, the exact date is not recorded, and the exact circumstances are equally obscure, Cenwalh decided to repudiate his Mercian wife. He set her aside. He ended the marriage, and then, according to some sources, he took another wife in her place. That other wife was Siaxber. We do not know when Siaxber entered Cenwalh's life. We do not know where she came from, whether she was a West Saxon woman of noble birth, or a woman from one of the neighbouring kingdoms, or perhaps the daughter of a chieftain or thane from somewhere within the borders of Wessex itself. No source records her parentage. No chronicle names her father. No genealogy connects her to any known dynasty. She arrived in the story of Cenwalh and in the story of Wessex without a past that history has thought to preserve, and she would depart from it in much the same way, without explanation, without ceremony, leaving only the bare fact of her presence in the chronicle's brief notation. What we can say is this: she was real. She was Cenwalh's queen, and whatever the precise sequence of events, whether Cenwalh dismissed his Mercian wife specifically in order to marry Ceiaxbur, or whether the repudiation and the new marriage were separate events connected only by time, the result was the same. Penda's sister was cast aside, and Penda himself was furious. In the language of 7th century politics, what Cenwalh had done was not merely a personal matter. It was a public insult of the gravest kind. The marriage between his sister and the King of Wessex had been the formal instrument of peace between the two kingdoms, the visible, living symbol of Mercia's dominance and Wessex's acceptance of that dominance. To repudiate that marriage was to reject the peace, to slap aside the hand that Mercia had extended, to declare, as loudly as any words could have declared, that Cenwalh no longer considered himself bound by the arrangement. Whether or not that was precisely what Cenwalh intended, it was certainly how Penda chose to interpret it. Bede, drawing on the traditions that had been passed down to him, framed the story in moral terms. Cenwalh had refused the faith, Bede wrote, and he had also put away his lawful wife, and in doing so, he had brought divine retribution upon himself. For Penda retaliated. He gathered his forces and marched on Wessex, and Cenwalh, facing the full weight of Mercian military power, was driven from his kingdom. The year was somewhere around 645. The exact date is debated. Some scholars place the exile in the mid-640s, others somewhat later. But the broad outline is agreed upon by all the sources that mention it. Cenwalh, driven out of Wessex by the fury of Penda of Mercia, fled eastward. He crossed the boundaries of his own kingdom and made his way to East Anglia, where the king who ruled was a man called Anna. Anna of East Anglia was, by all accounts, a devout and gentle man. Bede speaks of him with great warmth, describing him as a good man and happy in a good and holy issue, meaning that he was not only personally virtuous, but had been blessed with children of exceptional piety. His daughters, in particular, would become some of the most celebrated saints of early Anglo-Saxon Christianity. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. What matters for our story is that when Cenwalh arrived at Anna's court, a king in exile, stripped of his kingdom, his crown, and whatever dignity the events of the past few months had left him, Anna received him with hospitality. We do not know what Cenwalh thought about in the long months and years of that exile. We do not know whether he feared for his life. We do not know whether he missed his kingdom or his queen, or the familiar rhythms of the West Saxon court. What we do know is what happened to him during those years, and it was, by any measure, a significant change. Cenwalh converted to Christianity. Bede records this transformation as the natural consequence of living in the household of a virtuous Christian king, that the influence of Anna and his pious court gradually penetrated the resistance that Cenwalh had maintained since his accession. Cenwalh was baptized, and the baptism was, in the context of his times, a genuine turning point. Whatever had brought him to this moment, whether it was genuine spiritual conviction or the slow erosion of paganism in an overwhelmingly Christian environment, or a pragmatic recognition that the Christian kingdoms of England were the ones with the most powerful connections and allies, Cenwalh emerged from his years in East Anglia as a Christian king. He spent 3 years there, if Bede's account is to be trusted. 3 years is a long time, long enough to transform a man, long enough to change the shape of a kingdom. And while Cenwalh was in exile, what was happening in Wessex? The answer, according to the sources, is somewhat murky. The kingdom appears to have been administered by local sub-kings or chieftains, figures who stepped into the vacuum left by Cenwalh's departure and carved out their own spheres of influence in the absence of central authority. It was a pattern that would repeat itself with much greater consequence at the end of our story after Saexbur's own brief reign. We do not know, in all of this, what happened to Saexbur. She arrived in the historical record as Cenwalh's wife, and she would reappear at the end of his reign, stepping from the shadow of his kingship into the brief, bright light of her own governance. But in the years between, the years of exile and return, of conversion and reconsolidation, she is absent from the chronicle. We cannot say with certainty whether she stayed in Wessex, exercising some informal authority during her husband's absence, or whether she followed him into exile, or whether she simply waited, in silence, for events to resolve themselves. What we can say is that the exile ended. Cenwalh returned to Wessex, and the kingdom that he reclaimed was not quite the same kingdom he had left. It would be a mistake in telling the story of these middle decades of Cenwalh's reign to focus only on the wars and the politics, because the years between Cenwalh's return in 648 and his death in 672 were also years of social and cultural change. Years in which Christianity was not merely a political label, but a living, growing presence in the life of the West Saxon court and the communities around it. And the world that Christianity was creating in Wessex was the world in which Saexbur spent her years as queen consort, the world she would eventually inherit. Christianity in 7th century Wessex was still new enough to be transformative. The first generation of baptized West Saxons was, in the 640s and 650s, still alive. The monasteries and minsters that would eventually give the landscape its characteristic shape, the abbeys at Glastonbury and Malmesbury and Wimborne, the minsters at Sherborne and Bath, were either still in their infancy or had not yet been founded. The Church of Winchester, the old minster that Cenwalh had built or commissioned, was one of the most significant Christian establishments in the kingdom, and its proximity to the royal court at Winchester meant that the rhythms of its life, its prayers, its feasts, its ceremonies, its scholarship, were woven directly into the rhythms of the royal household. For Saexbur, living at the center of this world, the church would have been an inescapable presence. Even if she was not personally devout, and we cannot know whether she was, the liturgical calendar of the Christian year shaped the pattern of her days. The great feasts of Christmas and Easter, the fasts of Lent and Advent, the feast days of the saints whose names dotted the calendar. All of these structured the year in ways that a queen could not ignore. They determined when the court feasted and when it fasted, when it gathered in ceremony and when it dispersed, what gifts were expected to be given and to whom. The church was not separate from the life of the royal court in this period. It was woven into it at every level. And the church was also, in these years, a source of political tension. We have already noted the conflict between Cenwalh and his bishops, the quarrel with Agilbert that led to the creation of a second diocese, and the later conflict with Wini that left the West Saxon Church without a bishop for a period. These ecclesiastical disputes were not merely religious matters. In a world where the Church owned vast amounts of land, where bishops were important political figures and where the relationship between king and church was one of the fundamental structures of governance. Questions about who led the church in Wessex were questions about power and authority and the distribution of resources. Saxe-Burr would have lived through all of this. She would have seen the bishops come and go. She would have understood, in the way that people at the center of any political institution understand, that the religious questions and the political questions were not separate things, but aspects of the same underlying reality. Who held power? Who was loyal to whom? What obligations ran in which directions? How the structures of governance were maintained and reproduced over time. This understanding, this practical intelligence about the workings of power in a particular world, would have been one of her most important assets when she came to the throne in 672. She had spent years watching Cenwalh navigate the complex terrain of West Saxon politics, the relationship with the church, the management of the nobility, the maintenance of the border defences, the negotiation with Mercian power. She had not merely witnessed these things from a distance. She had been part of them, advising perhaps in the informal ways that queens advised, managing, certainly, the relationships of the royal household that were the capillary system of the kingdom's political body. When the moment came, when Cenwalh was gone and someone had to govern, Saxe-Burr was the person who understood, more completely than anyone else in Wessex, what governing actually required. One of the dominant realities of the long second half of Cenwalh's reign was the continued pressure of Mercia under its new king, Wulfhere. Penda had died at the Battle of Winwed in 655, killed by Oswiu of Northumbria, who had at last managed to gather a coalition strong enough to defeat the most formidable military power in Anglo-Saxon England. Penda's death was, in some respects, an enormous relief for Wessex. The man who had driven Cenwalh into exile was gone. The most aggressive external threat to the West Saxon kingdom had been removed. For a brief period, Cenwalh might have hoped that the pressure would ease. But Penda's death did not mean the end of Mercian aggression. It meant only a change of personnel. Wulfhere, one of Penda's sons, emerged from the turbulent years immediately following his father's death to establish himself as king of Mercia around 658, and he proved to be almost as formidable a neighbour as his father had been. Wulfhere did not share his father's paganism. He was Christian, converted in the years immediately following Winwed. But his Christianity did not diminish his appetite for territorial expansion. He pushed southward and eastward, absorbing West Saxon lands north of the Thames, and eventually, around 661, advancing all the way to the Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight, in the geography of early Anglo-Saxon England, was a significant prize. It was agriculturally productive, defensible, and strategically positioned at the entrance to the Solent, the stretch of water separating the island from the mainland of Hampshire. Its population, the Jutes, had been among the earliest of the Germanic settlers in Britain, and their history was distinct from that of the West Saxons proper. Cenwalh had, at various points, exercised at least nominal authority over the island, but when Wulfhere came south in 661, he stripped away that authority, giving the island and its surrounding territories to his godson Ethelwald, the king of the South Saxons. It was a deliberate humiliation of Cenwalh, a demonstration that Mercia, not Wessex, was the dominant power in southern England. These losses, the lands north of the Thames, the Meon Valley, the Isle of Wight, shaped the geography of the kingdom that Saxe-Burr would eventually govern. By the time she came to the throne in 672, Wessex was a kingdom that had been significantly trimmed on its northern and eastern edges. Its heartlands, the chalk downs of Dorset and Hampshire and Wiltshire, The valleys of the rivers that drained southward to the sea were still intact, but the expansive Thames-reaching Wessex of earlier generations was gone, replaced by a more compact kingdom that was learning to orient itself southward and westward. This reorientation had practical consequences. Winchester, Cenwalh's Christian capital, sat in the heart of the surviving kingdom, in the valley of the Itchen, well south of the territory that Mercia had absorbed. The Old Minster, Cenwalh's great project of Christian building, was safely within the boundaries of what remained. The ecclesiastical reorganization that had moved the bishop's seat from Dorchester-on-Thames to Winchester, a move that had, at the time, seemed like an administrative decision about diocesan structure, proved, in retrospect, to have been a prescient one. Dorchester was eventually absorbed into the Mercian sphere. Winchester became the enduring centre. Sexbur, as queen consort through all of this, would have understood the shape of the kingdom's losses as well as any person in Wessex. She would have seen the messengers arrive with news from the north. She would have heard the debates about how to respond to Wulfhere's advances, whether to fight, to negotiate, to concede and preserve what remained, or to attempt some diplomatic manoeuvre that might slow the erosion of West Saxon territory. She would have known which of the king's councillors favoured which approach, and she would have had views of her own, formed over years of careful attention to the workings of the court. When Cenwalh died in 672, leaving behind a kingdom that was smaller than the one he had inherited, and more internally fragile than the historical record might suggest, Sexbur stepped forward to govern it. She did not step forward into a kingdom at the height of its power. She stepped forward into a kingdom under pressure, with contested borders and uncertain loyalties, and the ever-present shadow of Mercian power to the north. Whatever she managed to accomplish in the year or two of her reign, she accomplished under those conditions. And that context, that reality of governing a diminished and pressured kingdom, is part of what makes her achievement worth remembering. When Cenwalh came back to Wessex, around the year 648, by the most commonly accepted dating, he was a changed man. He was Christian now, baptized and committed to the new faith, and he brought with him not only his restored kingship, but the intention to give that kingship a new character, a new spiritual foundation. The most visible expression of this intention was the building of what would become one of the most important churches in early English history, the Old Minster at Winchester. Winchester itself deserves a moment of description. In Cenwalh's time, the city that the Romans had called Venta Belgarum, the market town of the Belgae, and that the Anglo-Saxons were calling Wintancester, was already an ancient place. Its walls were Roman, its street plan still broadly following the grid that Roman engineers had laid down centuries before. It sat in the valley of the River Itchen, in the heart of the West Saxon lands, surrounded by the chalk downs that give Hampshire its distinctive character. It was not yet the capital that it would one day become under Alfred the Great, but it was already a place of significance, a town where the mechanisms of West Saxon authority had begun to concentrate. Into this town, Cenwalh brought the full weight of his newly Christian piety. He founded a church dedicated to St. Peter and St. Paul, what would later be known as the Old Minster, to distinguish it from the later churches that grew up around it. The exact date of its founding is a matter of some scholarly debate. Some sources place it at 648, coinciding with Cenwalh's return. Others suggest it was built somewhat later, perhaps around 660, when the West Saxon diocese was formally reorganized and the bishop's see transferred to Winchester from its previous home at Dorchester-on-Thames. What is certain is that the Old Minster was Cenwalh's project, the physical embodiment of his transformation from pagan exile to Christian king, and that it would stand for centuries as one of the great ecclesiastical centres of southern England. Around this same time, the Diocese of Wessex was reorganised in a manner that reveals something interesting about Cenwalh's character. He had a bishop at Dorchester-on-Thames named Agilbert, a Frankish scholar who had come to Wessex from Ireland and taken up the episcopal see there. Agilbert was learned and presumably effective, but he had one quality that eventually exhausted Cenwalh's patience. He could not speak the language of the West Saxons. He preached and conducted his ecclesiastical business in Latin, or perhaps in Frankish, but he could not address the king or the West Saxon people in their own tongue. And Cenwalh, who understood nothing but Old English, grew weary of what Bede describes as that bishop's barbarous tongue. He imported another bishop, a West Saxon named Winnie, who had been ordained in France, and divided the diocese, creating a new episcopal see at Winchester and pushing Agilbert sideways into the older see at Dorchester. This decision would have consequences. Agilbert was offended and eventually left Wessex entirely, going to the continent and eventually becoming Bishop of Paris. Winnie, too, would later quarrel with Cenwalh and depart, eventually taking refuge with Wulfhere of Mercia, which was taken by later scholars as an indication of just how deeply Mercian influence had penetrated even into the religious life of Wessex. But for the moment, Winchester was established, the Old Minster was being built, and Cenwalh had returned to his kingdom a Christian king with a Christian capital. But the threats to Wessex did not disappear with Cenwalh's return. Penda of Mercia was still alive, still aggressive, still the most powerful single force in Anglo-Saxon England. And Penda's son Wulfhere, who would succeed him in 655, was if anything even more of a danger to the southern and eastern borders of Wessex. Around the year 661, Wulfhere led a devastating campaign southward, advancing all the way to the Isle of Wight and detaching it from West Saxon control, giving it instead to his godson Ethelwald, the king of the South Saxons. He also stripped away the Meon Valley from Cenwalh's territory. The lands north of the Thames, which had once been part of the West Saxon domain, were also absorbed by Mercia during this period, pressing Wessex southward and westward, forcing the kingdom to reorient itself toward the coast and the western hills. It was a kingdom under pressure, slowly shrinking on its northern edge, compensating with occasional victories in the west. Where Cenwalh succeeded in driving the Britons to the River Parrett, pushing the frontier of West Saxon settlement further into what would eventually become Somerset. It was a kingdom of contested borders and uncertain futures, a kingdom governed by a man who had seen exile and transformation and had emerged from both with a certain hardness of purpose, if perhaps not always a perfect judgment of what was required. And through all of this, through the political manoeuvring and the ecclesiastical reorganization and the border conflicts and the steady erosion of West Saxon territory by Mercian pressure, Sexbur was there, as queen consort, as wife, as the woman beside the king, unnamed in almost every source, unrecorded in almost every chronicle, present and invisible for the long decades of Cenwalh's restored reign. Let us pause here in the long middle years of Cenwalh's reign and spend some time thinking about what Sexbur's life might have looked like, not as a ruler, but as a queen consort in 7th century Anglo-Saxon England. We are entering territory where the historical record offers us almost nothing specific to her situation. We cannot know how she spent her days, what she thought, what she believed, what she valued or feared or hoped for. but we can understand something of the world she inhabited, the social structures that shaped her experience, and the role that a woman of her position was expected to play. In Anglo-Saxon England of the 7th century, a queen consort, the wife of a king, occupied a position of some social prominence, but not, in general, of independent political power. She was the king's partner in the management of the royal household, which in those days was itself a political and administrative unit of considerable importance. The royal household moved from estate to estate across the kingdom, and the management of that household, the provisioning, the hospitality, the relationships with the ecclesiastical houses and the local nobility, was very much a queen's domain. A capable queen consort in this period was, in effect, a senior manager of the most complex and politically sensitive enterprise in the kingdom. Beyond the household, a queen's influence was felt through her connections, through the relationships she maintained with the great families of the realm, through her role as patron and intercessor, through the position she occupied as the visible embodiment of the royal marriage alliance. In a society where political relationships were sealed and symbolized through kinship, a queen was herself a kind of living treaty, the human form of whatever diplomatic arrangement had created her marriage. For Saxburgh, who may have been a West Saxon woman without the kind of dynastic connections that would have given her independent political leverage, this aspect of queenship may have been somewhat attenuated. But she was nonetheless a figure of consequence, a woman whose presence at Kenwal's court gave shape and continuity to the institution of West Saxon kingship. And then there was the question of the church. By the time Saxburgh was Kenwal's queen, Christianity was the faith of the West Saxon court, the faith of the Old Minster at Winchester, the faith of the bishops and clergy who surrounded the royal household, the faith that shaped the rhythms of the year and the ceremonies of state. Whether Saxburgh was herself a believing Christian is something we cannot say with confidence. One early medieval source notes her religion as unknown, but the Christianity of the court would have been the Christianity she lived among, the faith whose calendar shaped her days and whose language gave form to the ceremonies she attended. What we can say with some confidence is that Saxburgh was a woman of intelligence and presence. She had survived as queen consort through one of the most difficult periods in West Saxon history. She had seen her husband driven into exile and restored to power. She had seen the borders of the kingdom eroded by Mercian pressure. She had watched the religious and political structures of the realm reorganized around her. And then, when Cenwalh died, when the king was gone and the throne was empty, she was the one who stepped forward to fill it. That does not happen by accident. Whatever qualities Saxburgh possessed, whatever combination of intelligence, political skill, personal authority, and sheer force of character she brought to bear, they were sufficient to make the men of Wessex, however briefly, accept her as their queen regnant. It is worth noting, before we move on, just how remarkable that acceptance was. In 7th century Anglo-Saxon England, the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was not merely unusual, it was almost unthinkable. The structures of Anglo-Saxon governance were built around male lordship. The king was above all a war leader, a man capable of leading armies into battle and winning the loyalty of warriors through gifts and feasting and the exercise of physical dominance. Women were not expected to perform those functions. They were respected. They were influential. They were in some circumstances genuinely powerful. But they were not rulers. The regnal lists of the period, the lists of kings that chroniclers compiled to track the succession of power in each kingdom, were lists of men. Every name in them was a man's name, except one. The question of who would rule after the death of a king was, in Anglo-Saxon England, one of the most dangerous questions a kingdom could face. Unlike later medieval systems, which would develop relatively clear rules of hereditary succession, primogeniture, the principle that the eldest son inherits, Anglo-Saxon kingship operated on a much more fluid set of principles. The king was expected to come from the royal family, and in Wessex, the royal family was defined broadly as those who could trace descent from Cerdic, the legendary founder of the kingdom. But within that broad category, the exact identity of the next king was determined not by automatic inheritance, but by a combination of factors: the relative strength of the various claimants' genealogical connections to the previous king, the political alliances and personal loyalties of the kingdom's leading men, the military capability of the candidates, and sometimes simply the raw fact of who was present and prepared to press their claim most forcefully in the uncertain days after a king's death. In this system, the death of a king without a clear and widely acknowledged heir was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a political crisis of the first order. The absence of an obvious successor created a vacuum, and vacuums, in the politics of the early medieval period, were filled rapidly and often violently. The men who had been the dead king's closest supporters became, in the days after his death, the brokers of the succession, the people whose choices and commitments would determine who ended up on the throne. If they agreed, the transition could be swift and relatively peaceful. If they disagreed, the result was civil war. In 672, the nobility and the leading churchmen of Wessex faced this situation without the benefit of an obvious answer. Cenwalh had died with no sons, no daughters, no siblings, whose children might have provided a clear line of succession. The nearest male relatives of royal blood were all quite distant, connected to the House of Wessex through branches that had diverged several generations back. Among them was a man named Cenphus, whose son Esquine would eventually succeed Seixbur. But Cenphus, if he was still alive in 1672, was not in a position to step forward immediately with an overwhelming claim. Into this uncertain situation came the figure of Seixbur. She had, on her side, several things that none of the potential male claimants could match. She had continuity. She was the living embodiment of the royal household, the person who had most recently and most visibly embodied queenship in Wessex. She had relationships, years of them, built up through the daily work of managing the court and maintaining the connections between the royal household and the nobility and the church. She had knowledge, an intimate understanding of the kingdom's affairs, its finances, its political geography, its promises and its debts, that no distant male claimant could have possessed. And she had, perhaps most importantly, the support, at least initially, of enough of the kingdom's leading men to make her governance possible. We do not know who those men were. We do not know what arguments were made, what inducements were offered, what specific commitments of loyalty were extracted in exchange for acceptance of a female ruler. We know only the outcome. Seixbur governed, for a year, perhaps two, and when she could govern no longer, when she died, or when the political balance shifted irrevocably in favor of a male successor, the transition to Esquine happened. Contested perhaps, untidy certainly, but not, in the end, catastrophic for the kingdom. The moment of Cenwalh's death and Seixbur's accession was, in this sense, a moment that tells us something important about the pragmatism of early medieval politics. The theory of governance in Anglo-Saxon England was overwhelmingly male. The king was a man, and the structures of lordship and military service and the distribution of land and treasure that underlay his authority were all built around the assumption of male governance. But theory and practice are never perfectly aligned, and in 672, practice asserted itself. The person who was available, who was known, who was accepted, who could hold the kingdom together in the immediate aftermath of the king's death, was a woman, and so a woman governed, not because the theory had changed, but because the immediate practical requirements of the situation demanded it. Cenwalh, King of Wessex, died around the year 672. The exact date is a matter of some scholarly dispute. A handful of sources suggest 673, or even 674, but the majority of careful historians accept 672 as the most likely year. He had reigned, with the interruption of his 3-year exile, for something approaching 3 decades. He had built Winchester into a centre of West Saxon religious and political life. He had fought wars on multiple fronts, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, and had seen the borders of his kingdom change and shrink and occasionally push back outward. He had converted from paganism to Christianity and had built the church that would serve as the heart of West Saxon ecclesiastical life for centuries to come. He had, in short, been a king of considerable activity and mixed results. He died without a known heir. This is one of the most significant facts about Cenwalh's death, and one that goes to the very heart of the question of how Sexbur came to rule. No son of Cenwalh is recorded anywhere in the historical sources, no daughter either. The historians who have looked most carefully at the question have concluded that Cenwalh and Seaxbur had no surviving children, and that Cenwalh's earlier marriage to Penda's sister also produced no children who survived to adulthood. He was, in the language of royal succession, a man who had come to the end of his line. This absence of an heir created a problem that the West Saxon kingdom had no established mechanism for resolving. In the normal course of events, a king died, and his son, or, in the absence of a son, his brother or his nephew, or some other male relative of sufficiently royal blood, stepped forward to claim the throne. But Cenwalh left no son. His brothers, if he had any, are not clearly identified in the sources. His nearest male relatives of the royal line were considerably more distant, cousins of cousins, men connected to the House of Wessex, by the kinds of genealogical threads that become very thin and very numerous as you follow them across several generations. Into this vacuum, this moment of genuine uncertainty about who, if anyone, had the legitimate right to claim the West Saxon throne, Sexbur stepped forward. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the moment with characteristic brevity. "This year King Cenwalh died," the chronicler wrote, "and Sexburga, his queen, reigned 1 year after him." That is all. No explanation of how this came to pass, no description of any council or assembly that might have recognized her authority, no account of the ceremony, if there was one, by which she was acknowledged as queen regnant. Just the bare fact, stated with the same matter-of-fact tone that the Chronicle uses for kings, for battles, for the deaths of bishops. She reigned. What made this possible? It is a question that historians have puzzled over, and to which the surviving sources offer only incomplete answers. The absence of a male heir is clearly part of it, with no obvious candidate to step into Cenwalh's place. The existing power structures of the kingdom may have found it easier to accept the continuity that Sexbur represented than to navigate the conflicts that would inevitably arise from choosing between competing male claimants. She was the king's widow, the woman who had managed the royal household and maintained the fabric of courtly relationships for however many years her marriage to Cenwalh had lasted. She was, in some sense, the institution of West Saxon queenship made flesh. the most obvious, most immediately available embodiment of royal continuity. There may also have been practical considerations. Saxe-Burr, whatever her origins, had spent years at the heart of West Saxon power. She knew the nobles, she knew the clergy, she knew the local lords and the ecclesiastical houses and the patterns of obligation and loyalty that held the kingdom together. A new king, especially one whose claim to the throne rested on a distant genealogical connection, would have needed time to establish himself, to build relationships, to make the kingdom's powerful men into his men. Saxe-Burr was already there. She was already known. And for a kingdom that had spent decades under pressure from Mercia, the stability she represented may have been genuinely valuable. To reign in the 7th century was not to issue edicts from a palace throne room. It was not to sit in splendid isolation while ministers managed the affairs of state. It was an intensely personal, intensely practical, intensely physical activity. Because the royal court of Anglo-Saxon Wessex was not a fixed institution in a fixed location, but a mobile one, moving across the landscape of the kingdom from royal estate to royal estate, consuming the food renders and hospitality dues that the estates owed the crown, and in doing so, making the presence of royal authority physically visible and tangible to the people of each locality in turn. This peripatetic style of royal governance, sometimes called the itinerant court, was the normal mode of Anglo-Saxon kingship. A king, or in Saxe-Burr's case a queen, could not govern effectively simply by sending orders from a distance. She needed to be present, to ride from estate to estate, to hear disputes and render judgments, to receive the renders of food and cattle and honey and cloth that the estates owed, to accept the hospitality of local lords, and in accepting it to confirm their status and their loyalty. The court was not merely the administrative centre of the kingdom. It was the kingdom's most visible symbol, the embodiment of royal authority as a living, moving presence in the landscape. For a woman in Saxe-Burr's position, the logistics of this mode of governance would have been formidable. She would have needed to maintain a household, servants, clerks, ecclesiastical personnel, personal attendants, capable of moving efficiently from place to place. She would have needed to manage the relationships with the great estates that supplied the court's needs, ensuring that the renders were paid and that the hospitality was adequate to the needs of the royal entourage. She would have needed to adjudicate disputes, not necessarily in person in every case, but in the sense of being the ultimate authority to whom appeals could be directed and in whose name judgments were issued. And she would have needed to maintain at all times the dignity and the ceremonial weight of royal authority. In a world without mass communication, the presence of the ruler was the primary mechanism by which royal authority was made real to most people. The queen, who arrived at an estate, who presided over a feast, who heard a dispute and rendered a judgment, was making the abstract fact of royal governance concrete in a way that no document or messenger could fully replicate. Saxe-Burr, governing a kingdom that was already under internal pressure from the sub-kings Bede describes, would have needed to make her authority as visible and as convincing as possible. Whether she succeeded fully in this, whether she was able to project the kind of authority that would have been natural for a male king, we cannot know. What we can say is that the kingdom did not collapse during her reign. The records of the period after her death do not describe a kingdom in ruins, a nobility in chaos, a church in crisis. They describe a kingdom in transition, a kingdom passing from one ruler to the next, with the kinds of difficulties and continuities that such transitions always involved. That transition, however imperfect, speaks to the basic stability of whatever Saxe-Burr managed to maintain during her time on the throne. There is also the question of how she handled the most sensitive aspect of her situation, the relationship with the men of the kingdom. In Anglo-Saxon England, the bond between a lord and his followers was built on personal loyalty. On the oath sworn at the mead hall table, the gift given from the king's own hand, the feast shared in the great hall, where the bond between ruler and subject was renewed and reinforced. Women could participate in this ritual world. A queen was expected to be the hostess of the feast, the distributor of cups and gifts, the gracious presence at the lord's side. But whether they could inhabit it as the central figure, the lord to whom oaths were sworn and from whose hand the gifts came, was a genuinely open question. Saxe-Burr had to answer that question in practice. She had to stand at the centre of the mead hall, or whatever passed for it in the peripatetic court of 7th century Wessex, and make her authority real to the men around her. And for a year, at least, enough of them accepted that authority to allow the kingdom to continue functioning. And so Saxe-Burr became what no woman in Anglo-Saxon England had been before her, and what no woman in Anglo-Saxon England would clearly be again for centuries. A queen regnant, not a regent for a young son, not a consort exercising influence through her husband, a ruler in her own right, sua jure, as the Latin phrase has it, by her own right. What did that mean in practice? What did Saxe-Burr actually do during the year or two that she occupied the throne of Wessex? Here, the historical record fails us almost completely. The chronicle records her reign in a single sentence, and that is essentially all that has been preserved. We have no laws issued in her name, no grants of land bearing her seal, no letters or documents that would give us a window into her governance. She is a queen who ruled, and who left almost no direct trace of how she ruled. What we can do is think about the context, the world in which her reign took place, and what it would have demanded of her. When Saxe-Burr came to the throne, Wessex was a kingdom that had been significantly weakened by the territorial losses of the previous decades. The lands north of the Thames were gone, absorbed by Mercia. The Isle of Wight was in the hands of the South Saxons, administered on Wulfhere of Mercia's behalf. The southern and western borders of the kingdom were more secure. Cenwalh had pushed the Britons back beyond the Parret, but the northern frontier was where the pressure was greatest, and it was there that the kingdom was most vulnerable. Wulfhere of Mercia was still alive and active when Saxe-Burr came to power. He would not die until 675, which was after Saxe-Burr's reign had ended, and he remained a formidable figure throughout her time on the throne. The question of how a queen regnant, a woman ruling in a society that had no established framework for female governance, would manage the relationship with a powerful neighbouring king is one that the sources give us no direct answer to. We do not know whether Wulfhere chose to probe Saxe-Burr's defences, or whether he was occupied elsewhere during her reign, or whether some diplomatic arrangement was reached that kept the peace on Wessex's northern border. What we know is that Saxe-Burr's reign, however brief, did not end in military catastrophe. The kingdom survived her, intact enough to be passed on to her successor. And then there is the question of what was happening internally, within the borders of Wessex itself, during Saxe-Burr's reign. Here, the evidence is more complex and more interesting, because alongside the chronicle's brief notation of Saxe-Burr's queenship, there is another account, Bede's account, that tells a very different story. Bede the Venerable, the monk of Jarrow who wrote, in the 720s and 730s, the great ecclesiastical history of the English people, is one of the most important sources we have for the history of early Anglo-Saxon England. His history is detailed, careful, and deeply influential. When Bede wrote about a kingdom or a king, later historians paid attention, and Bede, writing about the period following Cenwal's death, says something that sits in fascinating and unresolved tension with the chronicle's record of Ceyxbur's reign. Bede says that after the death of Cenwal, sub-kings took upon themselves the government of the kingdom, and dividing it among themselves held it 10 years. Sub-kings, not a widow queen, not a queen regnant, not Ceyxbur at all, whose name Bede nowhere mentions in connection with the governance of Wessex. Instead, Bede describes a fragmentation of West Saxon authority, a period in which the unified kingship of Wessex broke apart into competing pieces, each governed by a man who claimed some portion of royal authority for himself. And he says this fragmentation lasted for 10 years, a period that encompasses and extends well beyond the brief reign that the chronicle attributes to Ceyxbur. How do we reconcile these two accounts? It is a question that historians have wrestled with for a long time, and it does not have a simple or fully satisfying answer. Several possibilities have been proposed. The first possibility is that both accounts are, in their own ways, accurate, that Ceyxbur did indeed exercise some form of central royal authority for approximately 1 to 2 years after Cenwal's death, but that her authority was contested, partial, or limited from the beginning by the emergence of competing sub-kings within the kingdom. Under this reading, the chronicle captures the formal or nominal reality that Ceyxbur was acknowledged, at least in some quarters and for some period, as the Queen of Wessex, while Bede captures the messier political reality, which was that the kingdom was already beginning to fragment and that Ceyxbur's authority was never as complete or as secure as the chronicle's brief notation might suggest. The second possibility is that Bede deliberately excluded Ceyxbur from his account. This suggestion has been made by several scholars who have examined Bede's treatment of Cenwal's reign and noticed something interesting. When Bede writes about Cenwal, he mentions, without naming her, that Cenwal had put aside his first wife, the sister of Penda, and had taken another wife. That other wife is Ceyxbur. Bede mentions her existence, but he gives her no name, no personal identity, no individual presence in his narrative. And when the time comes to describe what happened after Cenwal's death, Bede erases her entirely, replacing her reign with a description of political fragmentation. Why might Bede have done this? The answer that scholars have most commonly proposed is that Bede considered Ceyxbur's marriage to Cenwal to be illegitimate, or at least morally questionable. In Bede's strongly Christian understanding of marriage and morality, Cenwal's repudiation of Penda's sister was a deeply problematic act. It was, in effect, a divorce. And in 7th century Christian thinking, divorce was not something that could simply be set aside. If Cenwal's first marriage was, in Bede's view, the real and legitimate marriage, then Ceyxbur was not a legitimate queen. She was, at most, a woman who had lived with Cenwal outside the proper bonds of marriage, and a woman in that position had no legitimate claim to the throne of Wessex. Whether or not we agree with Bede's moral framework, and most modern historians do not apply 7th century ecclesiastical standards to questions of historical legitimacy, the practical consequence of his view is clear. He simply left Ceyxbur out. He wrote around her. He described the period of her reign as a period of political fragmentation, which allowed him to account for the years between Cenwal's death and the emergence of the next clearly acknowledged king, without ever having to acknowledge that a woman had ruled Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, by contrast, had no such qualms. Compiled roughly a century and a half after the events in question, and drawing on a different set of traditions and sources, it recorded Saexbur's name and her reign without apparent hesitation. Sexburga, his queen, reigned 1 year after him. For the compilers of the Chronicle, this was simply a historical fact, as worthy of record as any king's succession, and recorded in exactly the same way. The tension between these two accounts, the Chronicle's brief acknowledgement and Bede's deliberate silence, is, in itself, one of the most historically significant things about Saexbur's story, because it shows us something about how history is made, about the choices that chroniclers make, about the biases they bring to their work, about the way in which the decision to record or not to record is itself an act of power. Bede's silence did not make Saexbur disappear. The Chronicle preserved her, but his silence did shape how she was remembered, or rather, how she was not remembered, for many centuries after her death. To understand why Saexbur appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle at all, why her name was preserved when so many other women of the period have vanished completely, we need to understand something about the Chronicle itself and the tradition of historical record-keeping in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is not a single document. It is a family of documents, a set of related texts, compiled in different monasteries at different times, which share a common ancestry, but have diverged as they were copied and updated and added to over the centuries. The earliest versions of the Chronicle appear to have been compiled in the reign of Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, some 200 years after the events concerning Saexbur. But those early compilers were drawing on older materials, annals, king lists, genealogies, and other records that had been maintained by monasteries and royal courts since the early Anglo-Saxon period. Among those older materials were the king lists, the records that tracked the succession of rulers in each kingdom, noting the name of each king, the year he came to power, and sometimes the year he died, and the name of his successor. These lists were maintained because they were practically useful. They allowed monasteries to calculate the dates of past events, to establish the chronology of ecclesiastical appointments, to resolve disputes about when grants of land had been made and by which king. They were not primarily literary productions. They were administrative tools. And in these lists, these dry, practical records of who followed whom on the throne of Wessex, Saexbur's name appeared, not because anyone had decided to write her story, not because anyone had concluded that she was particularly important or interesting, but because she had reigned and the people maintaining the list had noted the fact, and the fact had been transmitted from one copy to the next until it found its way, 2 centuries later, into the Chronicle that Alfred's scholars compiled. This is how most of what we know about the early Anglo-Saxon period has been preserved, not through dramatic acts of commemoration or deliberate history writing, but through the quiet, unglamorous work of monastic record-keeping, the continuous effort to keep track of events and dates and names year by year and generation by generation, in the small scriptoria of the English monasteries. The men who wrote down Saexbur's name in their king list probably gave her no more thought than they gave to any other entry. She was a fact. They recorded it. And the recording made it possible, 1400 years later, for her story to be told. This is worth remembering when we think about the relationship between history and memory. What gets remembered about the past is not simply what was most important at the time. It is also what was written down. And what was written down is shaped by the concerns and the practices and the assumptions of the people doing the writing. The monks who maintained the king lists of Wessex were, by the logic of their institutional role, interested in the succession of authority, in tracking who held power and when. They were not, primarily, interested in telling stories about individual people, but in noting Saxe-Burr's reign alongside the reigns of the kings before and after her. They preserved the essential information, the name, the date, the fact of rule, that allows us to reconstruct something of her story. Bede, by contrast, was a storyteller as well as a chronicler. His ecclesiastical history is a work of argument as well as a record of events. He was trying to tell a story about the Christianization of England, about how the church had grown and developed, about which kings had been virtuous and which had not, about the progress of divine providence through the history of the English people. And in that story, Saxe-Burr did not fit, or rather, she could only fit uncomfortably, as the product of a marriage that Bede found morally problematic, as a ruler whose authority rested on the kind of connection that Bede was not inclined to recognize. So Bede wrote around her. He described the period of her reign as a period of fragmentation, rather than as a period of female rule. He was not, as far as we can tell, lying. The fragmentation he described was real enough, but he was choosing, from among the available truths, the ones that suited his argument, and leaving the others, including the truth of Saxe-Burr's reign, unspoken. The clash between Bede's silence and the Chronicle's brief acknowledgement is, ultimately, a reminder that history is always interpretive, always a selection and a shaping of the past, rather than a simple recording of it. Neither Bede nor the Chronicle compilers were giving us the past as it actually was. They were giving us the past as their traditions, their concerns, and their choices had shaped it. Saxe-Burr's story, recovered from the gap between those two sets of choices, is inevitably partial and incomplete. But it is real, and it is worth telling. To govern Wessex in the 7th century was, in large part, to manage violence, not to commit it personally, though the kings of the period were expected to lead in battle, but to manage it, to direct it, to use it as a tool of political order and territorial expansion, and to protect the kingdom against its use by others. The King of Wessex was, above all else, a war leader. His authority derived from his ability to protect his people, to defeat his enemies, and to distribute the rewards of military success, the land, the treasure, the cattle, to the men who followed him and fought for him. This is the framework into which Saxe-Burr stepped when she took the throne of Wessex, and it is a framework that was, by any reasonable measure, not designed with a woman in mind. Anglo-Saxon society in the 7th century was organized around the concept of lordship, the relationship between a lord and his followers, built on obligation, loyalty, and the exchange of gifts and protection. The lord owed his followers leadership, reward, and the chance of glory. The followers owed their lord service, loyalty, and their swords. This relationship, the Mead Hall relationship, as scholars sometimes call it, after the great halls where lords feasted with their men and sealed the bonds of loyalty with gifts and shared drink, was the fundamental unit of Anglo-Saxon political organization. Women could participate in this system, but they could not easily embody its central function. A queen could distribute gifts, and queens were expected to do so, playing a specific role as the hostess and gift-giver of the royal hall. A queen could advise, could intercede, could manage the household and maintain the relationships that held the political structure together. But a queen was not expected to stand at the head of an army. And in a world where the legitimacy of rulership was bound up with the ability to do exactly that, Saexbur's position was inherently precarious. How did she manage this precariousness? We do not know. The sources do not tell us. We can only observe that she managed it sufficiently well to hold the throne for at least 1 year, and perhaps 2, without the kingdom dissolving into open conflict over the succession. Given the pressures that Wessex was under, and given the novelty of her position, that in itself was no small achievement. One possibility is that she governed through a combination of her personal authority as the king's widow and the support of a faction of West Saxon nobility who found her useful, who preferred the continuity of her governance to the disruption of a contested succession among male claimants. We know that Eswine, who eventually succeeded her, was from a collateral branch of the royal family, a 5th-generation descendant of Cynric, connected to the line of Cenwal's great-uncle Ceolwulf. He was not a figure of overwhelming political preeminence. If the nobility of Wessex had simply wanted to replace Cenwal with the nearest available male of royal blood, they could presumably have done so immediately. The fact that Saexbur held the throne for as long as she did suggests that there was, at least initially, genuine support for her governance, or at least genuine acceptance of it. Another possibility is that the sub-kings Bede describes were already active alongside Saexbur, that the West Saxon kingdom had already begun to fragment even before Cenwal's death, and that Saexbur's formal queenship was, in part, an attempt to maintain the fiction of central authority over a kingdom that was already dividing beneath her. Under this reading, Saexbur was not so much a powerful ruler as a figurehead, the last representative of Cenwal's unified kingship in a moment when that unity was dissolving. The truth, as with so many things about Saexbur, is almost certainly more complicated than either of these simple pictures. She was probably neither a triumphant and fully powerful ruler, nor a merely nominal figurehead. She was a woman in an impossible position, doing what she could with what she had, in a world that had no category for her and no established rules to govern her situation. And she governed for as long as she could, and then she died. In the centuries following Saexbur's death, the story of Wessex grew larger and more important, and more richly documented. The reign of Alfred the Great, who governed Wessex from 871 to 899, and is remembered as perhaps the greatest of all the Anglo-Saxon kings, produced a body of historical and literary work that transformed the way the period was understood. Alfred commissioned histories and translations and law codes. His court was a centre of learning in a way that no previous West Saxon court had been, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in Alfred's reign, looked back across the centuries and recorded, among much else, the brief, remarkable entry about Saexbur. But Alfred's achievement, magnificent as it was, also had the effect of casting everything that came before it into shadow. The centuries before Alfred, the centuries of the Heptarchy, of Penda and Cenwal and Saexbur, and the long, complicated process of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms finding their shapes, were less well documented, less celebrated, less visible in the historical record that later ages would draw upon. Alfred became the great figure of West Saxon history. The kings and queens who had preceded him receded. Saexbur receded with them. For most of the medieval period, she was simply a name in a list. One of the kings of Wessex, inserted almost accidentally between the last entry for Cenwal and the first entry for Esquine. The historians and chroniclers of the Norman and Plantagenet periods, writing in Latin and drawing on the great ecclesiastical tradition of historical scholarship, were generally uninterested in the figure of Saexbur. Their histories were concerned with the Norman conquest and its aftermath, with the development of the feudal system, with the careers of bishops and abbots, and the great families that dominated medieval England. A 7th century West Saxon widow queen was too remote, too poorly documented, too far outside their immediate concerns to attract serious attention. It was not until the scholarly revolution of the 19th and 20th centuries, the emergence of historical scholarship as a rigorous academic discipline, with its careful attention to primary sources and its interest in the social and political structures of past societies rather than merely the deeds of great men, that the figure of Saexburgh began to attract genuine scholarly interest. Historians working on Anglo-Saxon England began to look more carefully at the sources, to compare the chronicle's account with Bede's, to ask questions about the nature of queenship in the early medieval period, and to recover from the margins of the historical record the lives of women who had been overlooked or forgotten. This recovery is ongoing. The scholarship on Anglo-Saxon queens and queenship has grown substantially in recent decades, and Saexburgh has been one of the beneficiaries of that growth. We understand her situation better than any previous generation of historians has, better than Bede's contemporaries, better than the Norman chroniclers, better than even the Victorian scholars who first began to take a serious academic interest in early medieval England. We understand the political context more clearly, the sources more critically, the frameworks of gender and power more thoughtfully. We are better equipped to read the silence around her, to see what the chronicle recorded and what Bede omitted, and to draw from both a picture of a woman who is genuinely remarkable in her own right. But we must always remain honest about the limits of what we know. We can reconstruct the context. We can analyze the sources. We can place Saexburgh within the broader patterns of early Anglo-Saxon political life. What we cannot do is recover the person herself, the individual human being who stood at the center of all this history, who made the decisions and managed the relationships and held the kingdom together for a year. That person is lost to us, dissolved in the acids of time and the silences of the historical record, preserved only in the bare bones of what the chronicle chose to keep. And yet, in a way, that dissolution is part of her story. The fact that we know so little about Saexburgh is itself historically significant. It reflects the world she lived in, and the way that world valued or failed to value the experiences and achievements of women. The silence around her is not just an absence. It is evidence. It tells us something true about the 7th century, and about the patterns of historical memory that shaped how that century was preserved and transmitted. And it gives us, in the telling of her story, something to work against. A silence to fill, however partially and however tentatively, with the slow and careful work of historical imagination. Saexburgh died around the year 674. She was succeeded by Esquine, the son of a man called Cenfus, himself a descendant of Ceolwulf of Wessex, Cenwal's great uncle. Esquine would rule Wessex from approximately 674 to 676, a brief reign during which he notably defeated an invasion of Wessex led by Wulfhere of Mercia in 675, the kind of military action that a queen regnant could not easily undertake in person. After Esquine came Centwine, and after Centwine the great Cedwalla, and after Cedwalla the famous Ine, under whom Wessex would be codified into a more formally organized kingdom with written laws and a stronger administrative structure. The West Saxon line would go on through the storms of the Viking Age and the genius of Alfred the Great, and the gradual, extraordinary process of the unification of England. The kingdom that Saexburgh had governed for a year, battered, diminished, squeezed between Mercia and the sea, would eventually become the kingdom from which England itself was born. Alfred, who would be buried in the city of Winchester, that Cenwalh had made a centre of West Saxon life, was a direct descendant of the same dynasty that had produced Cenwalh and the kings who came before him. England's story runs through Wessex, and Wessex, for 1 year, was governed by a woman. But Saexburh herself did not found a dynasty. She did not have children who inherited the throne. She did not live long enough to build the kind of sustained political legacy that would have given later generations a framework within which to remember her. She left behind only the single sentence in the chronicle: Sexburga, his queen, reigned 1 year after him. And the knowledge, preserved in that sentence, that she had been there. That knowledge matters. It matters because Saexburh's presence in the chronicle is itself evidence of something. Evidence that the men who compiled and preserved the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, writing in the 9th and 10th centuries on the basis of earlier records and traditions, did not consider it strange or inappropriate to record a woman's reign alongside the reigns of men. They did not erase her as Bede had erased her. They treated her as a fact of history, as a ruler whose dates and succession were worthy of the same careful notation as any king. It matters also because Saexburh was not unique in the broader context of early medieval Europe. There are other examples, from the Frankish kingdoms and the Visigothic kingdoms of Spain, and the various successor states that emerged from the Roman Empire, of women exercising royal or near royal authority in the early medieval period. The idea that women could not rule, that it was inherently wrong or unnatural for a woman to occupy a position of political authority, was one that grew stronger, not weaker, as the medieval period progressed. The 7th century, for all its violence and its hierarchies, was in some ways more open to the possibility of female governance than the centuries that followed. Saexburh was, in this sense, a figure of her time, and also, in some ways, ahead of it. She ruled. She was the only Anglo-Saxon woman to do so in her own right, and to be acknowledged as such in the regnal list that history preserved. And in that single, remarkable distinction, she earns her place in the story of England. Let us think for a moment about what it means that we know Saexburh's name at all. In the 7th century, the literacy of Anglo-Saxon England was concentrated in the monasteries, in the scriptoria where monks bent over vellum and reproduced by hand the texts that their communities considered worth preserving. The chronicles that recorded the succession of kings were themselves monastic products, compiled and preserved by men who had very specific ideas about what history was and what it was for. They recorded kings because kings were the axes around which their world turned, because the relationships between the church and the crown, between abbeys and estates and royal grants and episcopal appointments, were the relationships that determined whether a monastery survived or was destroyed, whether a bishop held his see or was driven from it. Women in this monastic world of historical record-keeping were generally peripheral. They appeared as wives, as mothers, as saints, figures whose significance was defined by their relationship to men or to God. They did not, in general, appear in regnal lists. They did not appear as rulers. They appeared as the consorts of rulers, sometimes briefly and sometimes not at all. Saexburh is the exception. She appears in the chronicle not as a wife, not as Cenwalh's queen, who later retired to a monastery, or Cenwalh's widow, who was influential at court, but as a ruler. Sexburga, his queen, reigned 1 year after him. The verb is the key word, reigned, the same verb that the chronicle uses for every king in its list. She reigned. She was not merely present. She was not merely influential. She reigned. And then there is the question of what happened to Saexburh's memory in the centuries between her death and our own time. For most of that long interval, she was simply forgotten. Or rather, she existed as a name in the chronicle, a detail in a list, without the stories or the context that would have given her presence in history a full and human shape. She was not venerated as a saint, as some other women of her era were. She was not celebrated in poems or chronicles as a great queen. She was simply there, a name, a date, a single sentence. It is only in relatively recent times, in the past few centuries, as historians have begun to look more carefully at the early medieval period and to ask new questions about women's roles and experiences, that Saxby has started to receive something like the attention her story deserves. Historians like Elizabeth Norton, who has written about England's ruling queens, and Annie Whitehead, whose work on women of power in Anglo-Saxon England has helped to bring figures like Saxby into clearer focus, have done the work of recovering her from the margins of the historical record. Academic scholarship on Anglo-Saxon queenship more broadly, including the work of scholars like Stacey S. Klein, whose study of ruling women in Anglo-Saxon literature explores the cultural frameworks through which the period understood female power, has helped to contextualize Saxby's remarkable reign within its broader world. And what that scholarship tells us is something both humbling and inspiring. Saxby's story is not just a curiosity, not just an interesting footnote to the history of a kingdom that most people have only vaguely heard of. It is a window into the complexity of early medieval society, a reminder that the past was not a monolithic block of rigid hierarchy and absolute rule, but a living, complicated world in which the unexpected sometimes happened, in which women sometimes ruled, in which the gaps between what was supposed to happen and what actually happened were filled by individuals whose intelligence and will were sufficient to make them more than what their world expected. One of the most enduring legacies of the period that produced Saxby, the period of Kenwal's restoration and Christian conversion, was the establishment of Winchester as the great city of the West Saxons. We have mentioned Winchester many times in the course of tonight's story, but it deserves a moment of more sustained attention, because the Winchester that Cenwalh built and in which Saxby governed became something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Winchester in 648, when Cenwalh returned from exile and began the project of Christianizing and centralizing his kingdom, was a town of modest size and uncertain importance. The Roman walls still stood, but the streets within them were not densely occupied. The population was small by the standards of later centuries. The old minster that Cenwalh built, or that was built during his reign, whether or not he was personally its instigator, was a landmark of some significance, but it was a landmark in a landscape that was still being shaped, still finding its character, still deciding what kind of place it was going to be. Over the course of the late 7th and 8th centuries, Winchester grew. It grew in population, in the density of its occupation, in the range of activities that took place within its walls. The bishops of Winchester, the ecclesiastical figures who presided over the diocese that Cenwalh had established, became major figures in the political and cultural life of Wessex. The royal court, which under Cenwalh had been itinerant, spending time at Winchester, but also at many other royal estates across the kingdom, began to concentrate more consistently around the city. By the time of Alfred the Great, Winchester was the unambiguous capital of Wessex, the city where Alfred built his palace, where he established his schools, where he is buried, and where the dynasty that would create England had its centre. None of this would have been possible without the foundational decisions of Cenwalh's reign, the establishment of the Old Minster, the creation of the Diocese of Winchester, the concentration of royal and ecclesiastical resources in the city on the Itchen. And those decisions were made during the same years that Sexbur served as Queen Consort. The years in which the West Saxon court was, however imperfectly and uncertainly, building the foundations of the Winchester that Alfred would one day rule. Sexbur would have known Winchester as the most important city of her kingdom. She would have spent significant time within its walls, in the palace complex near the Old Minster, in the company of the bishops and the clergy and the noble households that were beginning to cluster around the centres of power. She would have understood its strategic and symbolic importance, the way it represented, in its combination of royal palace and Christian cathedral, the dual structure of authority that Cenwalh had worked to establish after his conversion. When she governed Wessex as Queen Regnant, Winchester would have been the most important place in her kingdom. It was there, probably, that the most significant decisions of her reign were made and announced. It was there that the clergy who prayed for her governance and provided the administrative support that governance required were concentrated. It was there that the Great Hall, or whatever passed for it in the royal complex of the period, was located, and in that hall that the bonds of loyalty that held the kingdom together were renewed through feast and gift, and the regular ceremonial display of royal authority. And it was there, probably, that she died. Sometime around 674, in the city that Cenwalh had built on the banks of the Itchen, the woman who had briefly governed the kingdom of Wessex came to the end of her story, and the city went on, growing and changing, and eventually becoming, 2 centuries later, the capital of something that neither she nor Cenwalh could have imagined, a united England governed by a single king who called himself not King of the West Saxons, but King of the English. The seed of that England was planted in Cenwalh's Winchester, and for 1 year that Winchester was governed by a queen. There is something that happens in the telling of very old stories that is difficult to articulate but easy to feel. A sense of contact, of reaching back across the centuries and touching, however briefly and however lightly, the reality of lives that were lived in what feels like an utterly different world, but was, in the ways that matter most, exactly like our own. People who loved and feared and hoped and governed and failed and succeeded and died. People whose names have survived or have not survived, depending on the accidents of time and the choices of the people who preserved the record. Sexbur's story is one of those old stories. It is so old that it feels, at times, almost inaccessible. Removed by 14 centuries from the world in which we live, set in a landscape that has been transformed almost beyond recognition, shaped by assumptions and values and ways of organizing social life that are deeply foreign to modern experience. And yet, in the essential human facts of it, the widow who had to find a way forward, the woman in a world that did not quite know what to do with her, the ruler who held authority for a brief and fragile moment and then was gone. There is something that reaches across the centuries and speaks. That reaching is what history is for, in the end. Not to make the past into a comfortable mirror of the present, not to pretend that the people of the 7th century thought and felt and valued the same things we do, but to recover from the enormous distance and the enormous silence, something of the texture of lives that were real as ours, as complicated, as full of contingency and accident and the constant small decisions that determine the shape of a life. Sexbur of Wessex was real. She ruled. She was for 1 year the governor of a kingdom that would one day contribute to the making of England. And tonight, in these quiet hours, her story has been told. Sleep well, knowing that the world you live in was made by people like her. People whose names we barely know, whose faces we will never see, whose voices have been silent for 1,000 years, but whose choices and whose courage and whose stubborn insistence on doing what was required of them in the moment that history gave them. Those things are woven into the fabric of everything that came after. She reigned. We remember. When Saxe-Burh died, sometime around 674, she left behind a kingdom that was still finding its shape. Eswine, who succeeded her, would reign for only 2 years before his own death or displacement. Centwine, who followed him, is known almost entirely from a single chronicle entry, noting that he drove the Britons to the sea in 682, a military achievement, but one that gives us very little sense of the man or his reign. The period following Cenwal's death was, just as Bede had described, a period of fragmentation and uncertainty, a time when the unified kingship of Wessex was contested and contested again, when the question of who truly held authority over the West Saxons did not have a simple or stable answer. It was not until the reign of Caedwalla, a young and aggressive claimant who seized power in Wessex around 685 or 686, that the kingdom began to reassert something like coherent royal authority. Caedwalla conquered the Isle of Wight, restored to West Saxon control the territory that Wulfhere had stripped away. He conquered Sussex and Kent. He was, by any standard, an extraordinary military figure. And he burned across the political landscape of southern England like a fire before. In 688, he abdicated his throne, travelled to Rome, was baptized by Pope Sergius III, and died just 10 days later, having achieved what seems to have been a lifelong ambition to receive Christian baptism in the Holy City. After Caedwalla came Ine, King Ine of Wessex, who would reign from around 688 to 726, one of the longest and most consequential reigns in the history of the kingdom. Under Ine, Wessex consolidated its territory, developed a written law code, one of the earliest surviving examples of Anglo-Saxon legislation, and established a second bishopric, building the foundations of the more organized kingdom that would eventually emerge. It was Ine's family, his dynasty, that Bede was most closely connected to, and it is perhaps worth noting, in this context, that Bede's dismissal of the sub-kings who followed Cenwal, including his silence about Saxe-Burh, may have been at least partly shaped by his sympathies with the Ine dynasty's version of West Saxon history. But that is by now a speculation about events and motivations that lie at some distance from Saxe-Burh herself. What matters for our purposes is that the kingdom she governed for a year or two, the battered, pressured, fragmentary kingdom of Wessex in the early 670s, eventually became the seedbed from which England grew. The West Saxon dynasty that ruled after Saxe-Burh's brief reign would, over the course of the next 2 centuries, gradually expand its authority, absorb the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, defeat the Viking armies that threatened to destroy everything, and create, out of the wreckage of the old heptarchy, something new. A single English kingdom, with a single English identity, governed from the city of Winchester, that Cenwal had made the heart of West Saxon Christian life. Saxe-Burh did not make that happen. She was too brief a figure, too poorly documented, too isolated in her remarkable singularity to be the cause of any particular long-term development. But she was part of the fabric of the thing, one thread in the long, complex weaving of the West Saxon story. And the thread of her story, however thin and however frayed at its edges, is the only thread in all of Anglo-Saxon history that belongs to a woman who ruled in her own right. We have spent many hours in Shakespeare's world tonight, walking through the politics of 7th century Anglo-Saxon England, through the reign of Cenwalh and the shadow of Penda, and the fragile, complicated moment of Shakespeare's own queenship. And yet, when we come to the end of the story, we must be honest about how much of it we do not know. We do not know where Shakespeare came from. Her parentage is entirely unrecorded in any surviving source. We cannot say with confidence whether she was a West Saxon woman of noble birth, or a woman from a neighbouring kingdom, or the daughter of a chieftain whose name has simply not been preserved. The lack of any record of her family is itself historically significant. It suggests that she did not come from one of the great dynasties of the period, whose genealogies were carefully maintained and widely referenced. But beyond that observation, we cannot go. We do not know when she married Cenwalh. We know she was his second wife, and we know that his first marriage, to the sister of Penda, ended sometime around 645, but whether Shakespeare entered the picture immediately, or whether there was a period of years between the end of the first marriage and the beginning of the second, the sources do not tell us. We do not know whether she had any children. The consensus among historians is that she and Cenwalh had no surviving offspring, and the fact that no son or daughter of Cenwalh appears in any source, and that the succession after Shakespeare went to a man connected to a completely different branch of the royal family, supports this conclusion. But absence of evidence is not, in itself, absolute proof. It is possible, though unlikely, that children existed and simply left no trace in the surviving records. We do not know what she believed. Her religion is unconfirmed in any source. The court she moved in was a Christian court, and the years of Cenwalh's reign were years in which Christianity was being embedded more deeply into the structures of West Saxon life. But whether Shakespeare was herself a believing Christian, or whether she was one of those individuals who lived alongside the new faith without fully inhabiting it, we simply cannot say. We do not know the exact circumstances of her death. We know only that around 674, her reign ended and Escwanes began. Whether she died of illness, or of old age, or of some other cause entirely, the chronicles do not record, and we do not know, most fundamentally of all, what she was like. Whether she was decisive or cautious, whether she was warm or cool, whether she was a woman who took pleasure in the ceremonies of power or found them burdensome, whether she was, at the end of her life, grateful for the years she had spent on the throne of Wessex, or whether she looked back on it with something more complicated, with the particular mixture of pride and grief that must attach itself to any reign that was both extraordinary and brief. We do not know these things, and that not knowing is itself part of Shakespeare's story, because the silence around her, the silences that Bede imposed, and the silences that simply accumulated as the centuries passed, and the documents that might have spoken about her were lost, is the price she paid for being the kind of person that the world she lived in was not built to remember. She was a woman. She ruled, and the structures of historical record-keeping, shaped overwhelmingly by men and for men, were not designed to preserve the full texture of her life. What they preserved instead was a sentence, a name, a verb. She reigned. There is a kind of history that exists in the quiet spaces, in the margins of great chronicles, in the footnotes of major narratives, in the entries that are present but not emphasized, recorded but not celebrated. It is the history of people who were real and significant in their own time, but who the structures of historical memory were not designed to preserve. Women, in particular, inhabit this quiet room of history in disproportionate numbers, not because they were less important than the men alongside whom they lived, but because the institutions that preserved historical memory were built overwhelmingly by men, for men, around the concerns and the categories that men of their time considered significant. Saexburgh is one inhabitant of that quiet room, but she is not alone there. Around her, in the early medieval world that produced her, there were countless other women whose stories have been lost or have survived only in fragments. Women who managed estates and resolved disputes and raised children who would shape the next generation. Women who advised their husbands and their sons on the political decisions that determined the futures of kingdoms. Women who founded monasteries and maintained the intellectual life of their communities. Women who served as abbesses and bishops, in all but name, governing ecclesiastical communities that were among the most important cultural institutions of the period. Some of these women have names that survive in the historical record. Ethelthryth of Ely, who became one of the most celebrated saints of early Anglo-Saxon Christianity. Hild of Whitby, whose double monastery was a centre of learning that produced 5 bishops. Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, who governed Mercia and led armies and built fortifications in the early 10th century. These women are known because they were extraordinary, or because the institutions connected to them, the monastery of Ely, the double monastery of Whitby, had an interest in preserving their memories. They are the visible tip of an iceberg whose vast submerged bulk consists of all the women who were real and significant and have been lost. Saexburgh sits at an interesting position in this landscape. She is known. Her name is in the chronicle, but she is barely known. The single sentence that records her reign is all we have of her direct presence in the historical record. She is more than the unnamed women who appear only as wife of or sister of some named man. But she is less than the women whose stories have been told in full, or in something approaching full, by the sources that have survived. This middle position, known but barely, present but almost invisible, is itself a kind of historical statement. It says something about the threshold of significance that women had to cross in order to be remembered at all in early medieval England. They had to rule. They had to found churches. They had to perform miracles after their deaths. The ordinary work of governance and counsel and household management and the raising of the next generation, the work that most women, including most queens, spent most of their lives doing, was not, in general, considered worth recording. Saexburgh crossed the threshold. She ruled. And so she was recorded, even if only barely, even if only in the bones of what the chronicle preserved. And that recording has allowed her story, however partial, however incomplete, however hedged about with the honest acknowledgement of what we do not know, to be told tonight, 1400 years after the year she held the throne of Wessex and held it alone. There is something in that persistence that deserves our attention and our respect. History, as the saying goes, is written by the victors. But history is also maintained by the meticulous, quiet work of scribes who wrote down what they saw, monks who copied what they received, scholars who looked carefully at what had been preserved and asked what it meant. In that chain of transmission, from the original record-keeping of Saexburgh's own time to the compilation of the chronicle to the scholarship of the modern period, her name has survived. Against the odds of time and neglect and Bede's deliberate silence, Saexburgh of Wessex has endured. And now her story is yours to carry forward, in memory, in the quiet hours of the night, in the simple knowledge that the world you live in is made of moments like hers, moments of unexpected courage and unexpected governance, moments when the space that was supposed to be empty was filled, instead, by a person who refused, or perhaps simply did not have the option, to stay on the margins. Eswine, who succeeded Cyaxares as King of Wessex around 674, is one of those historical figures who exist almost entirely in the shadow of the events around him, rather than in any documentary record of his own life and character. We know his name. We know his genealogy, or rather the genealogy that the chronicle assigns to him. He was the son of Cenphus, who was the son of Cenfrith, who was the son of Cuthgils, who was the son of Corwulf, the Corwulf who was Cenwal's great uncle, and who had ruled Wessex from 597 to 611, before Cynegils took the throne. Esquine was, in other words, a scion of the West Saxon royal family, but of a branch of it that had not held the throne for 3 generations. His emergence as Cyaxares' successor, rather than some more direct descendant of Cenwal, is itself evidence of the genealogical thinness of the immediate post-Cenwal succession. There were no closer heirs, and Eswine, whatever his other qualities, had at least the advantage of being a man, of fitting the expected form of Anglo-Saxon kingship in the most fundamental way, and of being sufficiently connected to the royal line to have a plausible genealogical claim. What we know of Esquine's reign comes essentially from a single source, the entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 675, which records that in that year Esquine and Wulfhere fought at Beardenhereford, a battle against the king of Mercia that the Chronicle implies Esquine and the West Saxons won, or at least survived without catastrophic defeat. This battle is significant because it shows that even after Cyaxares' reign, even in the confused and fragmented years that Bede described as a period of sub-king governance, there was someone in Wessex capable of organizing military resistance to Mercian aggression. Whether that someone was Esquine alone, or whether he was supported by a coalition of the very sub-kings Bede had described, men who had been governing their portions of Wessex independently, but who could coalesce against an external threat, we cannot say. What we can say is that the kingdom survived. Wulfhere of Mercia died in 675, the same year as the battle at Beardenhereford, perhaps weakened by the campaign, or simply at the end of a long and extraordinarily active reign. His death removed the most immediate external threat to West Saxon territory, at least temporarily, and Wessex continued, its line of kings continuing to stretch forward through Esquine and Tentwine and the extraordinary Cedwalla and the long reigning Ine, until the time came when the West Saxon dynasty would produce Alfred, and Alfred would forge from the battered remnants of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms the beginnings of England. Cyaxares stands at the very beginning of this long, complicated chain of events. She is the fragile link between Cenwal and Esquine, the brief and barely acknowledged moment of female governance that sits in the middle of the West Saxon regnal list, like a note written in a different hand, present, undeniable, and deeply surprising to anyone who comes to it without expecting to find it there. It is difficult, in telling Cyaxares' story, not to dwell on the losses, on all the things that the passage of 14 centuries has destroyed. The documents that might have spoken about her governance are gone. The charters that might have been issued in her name, the grants of land, and the confirmations of ecclesiastical privileges that Anglo-Saxon rulers routinely issued, and that form such a valuable part of the documentary record for other periods, have not survived, if they ever existed. The personal letters, if any, were written. The accounts of her court, if any, were kept. The testimony of people who knew her, which might have been recorded by the monasteries of the period, all of it, if it ever existed at all, has been lost. This loss is not accidental. the survival of historical documents from the early medieval period is itself shaped by patterns of power and privilege. Documents survive when institutions have an interest in preserving them. When the monastery that holds a charter of land needs that charter to defend its property rights. When the dynasty that an individual story reflects well upon has reason to maintain and copy the texts that celebrate them. Documents are lost when the institutions that held them are destroyed. By Viking raids, by Norman conquest, by the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, or when those institutions simply fail to maintain their archives, when the parchment decays and no one troubled to make a copy before it did. Shakespeare was not the kind of figure around whom institutions formed. She was not a saint whose memory was maintained by a monastery devoted to her cult. She was not the founder of a dynasty whose descendants would have an interest in celebrating her. She did not write, or if she wrote, nothing she wrote survived. She was a queen regnant for a year, and then she was gone, and the kingdom moved on without her. And the documents that might have told her story were never created, or were created and lost, and all that remained was the entry in the list and the silence around it. That silence is what we are working against tonight. Working against carefully and honestly, without pretending that we can fill it with certainties we do not have, but working against it nonetheless, because the silence is not the truth. The silence is a historical artifact, shaped by the decisions and the circumstances of the centuries between Shakespeare's death and the present. The truth, the actual historical truth, is that a woman governed the kingdom of Wessex for a year in the 7th century. Everything else is the accumulation of time and decay and the selective nature of historical preservation. And working against that silence is, in the end, what history is for. Not to give us a false certainty about the past, not to pretend that we know more than we do, but to recover, as carefully and as honestly as we can, the lives and the experiences and the achievements of people who were real and who mattered, and who the passage of time has threatened to reduce to nothing. Shakespeare was real, she mattered, and tonight, in the quiet hours before sleep, she has been recovered, however partially, however imperfectly, from the long silence in which she has rested. History is full of absences. Every name that appears in the record represents hundreds, perhaps thousands, of names that do not, people who lived and worked and governed and fought and loved and died in the same periods, in the same landscapes, as the people we know about, but whose lives have left no trace in the surviving documentation. The early medieval period, with its sparse and fragmentary records, its lost documents and destroyed archives, is particularly rich in these absences. For every name we know, there are countless we do not. But Shakespeare's absence is of a particular kind. She is not simply someone who fell between the cracks of historical record-keeping, someone who existed but was never recorded because she was too ordinary, too remote from the centers of power, too far from the concerns of the monks who did the recording. She was recorded. The chronicle has her name. She was present in the historical memory of at least some of the people who compiled and transmitted the early West Saxon records. And then she was partially erased by Bede's deliberate silence, by the passage of centuries, by the absence of the kind of sustained institutional memory that would have kept her story alive. That partial erasure, present in one source, absent in another, recorded but not celebrated, acknowledged but not explained, is itself a kind of historical statement. It tells us that Shakespeare's reign was significant enough to be recorded, but controversial enough, or inconvenient enough, or simply unfamiliar enough to the frameworks of expectation that the chroniclers were working within, to be omitted from the most influential historical account of the period. She sits in a middle space, more than forgotten, less than remembered, that is characteristic of a particular kind of historical figure, the person who was real and remarkable, but who the dominant narrative of their time and after their time found difficult to accommodate. This middle space is where a great deal of the most interesting history lives, the figures who fit neatly into the dominant narratives, the great kings, the warrior heroes, the saints, whose cults attracted institutional support, are often the most thoroughly documented, but the figures who fit uncomfortably, who challenge the expectations of their chroniclers, who occupy positions that the available categories don't quite fit, who are real but inconvenient, are often the ones who, when we do manage to recover them, tell us the most about the complexity of the past. Shakespeare tells us something about the complexity of Anglo-Saxon queenship, about the gap between the formal exclusion of women from the official structures of governance and the practical reality of what happened when the expected structures failed. She tells us something about the nature of historical memory, about how the decision to record or not to record is itself an exercise of power, and about how the silences in the historical record are as meaningful as its contents. And she tells us something about the endurance of individuals, about the way in which the bare fact of a name, a date, a sentence, can carry a person across 14 centuries and deliver them, still recognizably themselves, to the present. That is what the Chronicle did for Shakespeare, and that is what tonight has tried to do, however imperfectly, however hedged about with the necessary qualifications of historical uncertainty, to recover a person from the silence that threatened to swallow her, to give her back her name, her context, her significance, to say, against the grain of all the forces that have worked to reduce her to a footnote or to erase her entirely, she was there, she reigned, and we remember. We are near the end of our journey now. The candles of Shakespeare's world have burned low, and the long night of early medieval England is settling around us. Let us spend a few quiet moments in reflection before we say goodnight. What does Shakespeare's story tell us? It tells us, first and most simply, that history is not always what the most famous sources say it is. Bede was a great historian, one of the greatest the early medieval period produced, but he was also a man with a perspective, with biases, with assumptions about what mattered and what did not, about who deserved to be remembered and who could safely be left out. His silence about Shakespeare is not a neutral absence. It is a choice, and like all choices, it reflects the values and the limitations of the person who made it. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle made a different choice. Its compilers looked at the record of the year 672 and saw, as clearly as they saw the deaths and accessions of kings, the fact that a queen had reigned, and they wrote it down. Sexburga, his queen, reigned 1 year after him. That simple sentence is an act of remembrance, a small, quiet act of historical justice, performed by unknown hands, probably centuries after the events it describes. It is the reason we know that Shakespeare existed at all. It tells us, second, that the boundaries of what is possible in human society are never quite as fixed as they appear in any given moment. 7th century Anglo-Saxon England was a society built around male lordship and the exercise of male military power. And yet, in that society, a woman stepped onto a throne that was not supposed to be available to her and held it for a year. The structures that should have prevented it, the expectations, the conventions, the assumptions about who could and could not rule, were not sufficient in that particular moment to stop her. And it tells us, third, something about what it means to leave a mark on history. Saexburgh left almost nothing. No laws in her name, no monuments built under her direction, no descendants to carry her memory forward. She left only the fact of her reign, only the knowledge that she had been there, that she had governed, that the men and women of Wessex had, for a year, been subjects of a ruling queen. That fact, preserved in a single sentence, is her monument, and it has lasted nearly 1400 years. There is something in that endurance that deserves our respect and our quiet admiration. Saexburgh of Wessex, who came from nowhere we can identify, who married into a dynasty that was not her own, who governed a kingdom that was not built for her governance, and who died without leaving behind the kind of abundant, well-documented legacy that fills the pages of history books, has survived. Her name has survived. Her reign has survived. The sentence that records her has survived. And tonight, in the gentle hours before sleep, her story has found its way to you, across 14 centuries, and all the silences in between. We have come now to the end of our gentle journey through the life of Queen Saexburgh of Wessex, England's first ruling queen, the widow who held a throne, the woman whose name survived amongst deliberate silence and 1,000 years of obscurity to find its place, at last, in the quiet and unhurried telling of history. She was, when we meet her in the record, already a woman without a past, a queen whose origins the chronicles did not think to preserve, whose marriage to Kenwal was noted but never dated, whose face and voice and inner life are as lost to us as the faces and voices of almost everyone who lived in 7th century England. What we have of her is almost nothing. A marriage, a reign, a death, a sentence. But that sentence contains a world. It contains the whole extraordinary fact of her. A woman in a world of kings who ruled, for 1 year, or perhaps 2, the West Saxons, the people who would one day give rise to England itself, were governed by a queen, not a regent, not a consort, a queen regnant, suo jure, by her own right. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the world you live in is the product of a long, complicated, endlessly surprising history. A history full of people who did what was not supposed to be possible, who stepped into the spaces that their world had not prepared for them, who left behind something that lasted. Saexburgh of Wessex is one of those people. She reigned, and the chronicle remembered. Good night.